Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story.
It's strange, isn't it? How quickly you can settle into a new place as if it's always been yours, as though it was meant to be. I didn't think I'd be able to. Not after everything. Not after the divorce. I wasn't ready to start over, but life doesn't really give you a choice sometimes. The house was old in a way that made you feel like you were standing on the edge of something ancient, something that had seen too much. The kind of place where the floorboards creaked underfoot, where the windows groaned when the wind blew just a little too hard. The kind of place where it felt like the walls had stories of their own, stories they weren't quite ready to share. I remember walking through the front door for the first time, that musty smell that seemed to have settled into the very bones of the house. It wasn't unpleasant, just worn. Like the house had lived a life and I was only now stepping into it, taking up space where someone else had been. My stuff didn't fill the place, not yet. It was just me, alone in this house. The neighbors had told me about it in their own way. They didn't exactly warn me, but there was this undercurrent to their words. They'd say things like, "It's an old house, and you get used to the sounds after a while." They didn't need to say more. I could tell there was something off, but I brushed it aside. People talk, right? Sometimes they talk to fill the silence. The first few nights were uneventful. I didn't mind the creaks and groans of the house. It felt normal. It wasn't a mansion, just a small two-story with peeling wallpaper and crooked stairs. The kind of house you would expect to find in an old neighborhood like this, the kind that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It was perfect for me, a fresh start in a place that felt like no one else was around. But it wasn't long before things started to change. Little things at first. I remember sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps above me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The house was empty, right? I was alone. There were no pets, no children, just me. I tried to shake it off. Old houses settle. Maybe the wind was pushing the windows. But the footsteps came again, louder this time. Heavy. As if someone were walking across the floorboards above me. I stood up, trying to steady myself, but when I walked upstairs to check, the house was silent. No one there. Of course. I went back to the living room, my heartbeat slowly returning to normal, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few days later, I met the neighbor who lived next door. Mrs. Gardner, I think her name was. A frail woman with kind eyes, but there was something about her that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way she always seemed to be watching. She came over to introduce herself and brought me a loaf of bread. But as we talked, she glanced at the house and I saw her shudder. "I used to know the people who lived there," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You won't find many folks around here who'll tell you much about it. Some things are better left in the past, dear. Trust me." I didn't press her for details. But that night I started to wonder. What was it about this house that made her so uneasy? Was it just the age of the place, or was there something more to it? I pushed the thoughts out of my mind and went to bed that night, trying to ignore the soft sound of the wind rattling the windows. But as I lay there, something felt off. The temperature in the room dropped, just enough to make me shiver under the covers. The floor creaked again, too loud this time. It was like someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. I told myself I was just imagining it, but the feeling of being watched, of being waited for, settled into my chest. I could almost feel it, like someone was standing just outside the door, waiting for me to open it. I didn't. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head and tried to ignore the strange noises. I didn't sleep well that night. I don't think I slept well for a few nights after that. But it wasn't until a week later that things really began to change. I was sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was dragging a heavy object. Furniture, maybe? I set my cup down, my heart racing, and I stood up, walking slowly toward the stairs. The house was completely still. The dragging sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, I heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable. A whisper. My name. It wasn't my imagination. The voice was clear, soft, but unmistakable. It called me again. I froze, unable to move. The air in the house felt thick, charged. The kind of feeling you get when something's about to happen, something you don't want to see. I stood there, staring at the dark hallway, waiting for the whisper to come again. But it didn't. Instead, the house settled, the floorboards creaked again, and the whisper faded into silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move. I finally forced myself to take a step back. It was nothing. It had to be. Old houses do strange things. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. Something I couldn't see. Something that had been here long before I ever stepped foot inside. And for the first time since I moved in, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay. The days began to blur together after that. Each one felt the same, yet subtly different. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. I couldn't explain it, but the house had a way of making me feel like I was always being watched, always being followed. Even when I was in the kitchen, preparing a meal or washing dishes, I felt eyes on my back. But when I turned, there was nothing. Just the same empty rooms, the same old furniture. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself that I was just adjusting to a new place. People get nervous when they're alone in a new environment, right? It was probably nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But then came the dreams. They started on the second night after hearing the whisper. At first, they were nothing more than vague images, shadows moving across the walls, whispers too soft to understand. But as the days passed, they grew more vivid, more terrifying. I dreamt I was walking through the house, only it was different. The walls were darker, the air thicker. The rooms felt alive, like they were breathing. And in every corner, in every crevice, I could hear a voice calling my name. "Come closer," it whispered, soft but insistent. "We're waiting." I woke up with a start, my heart racing, my sheets soaked in sweat. The dream lingered even after I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I couldn't remember if it had been real or if it had just been the product of my tired mind. The house was still quiet, but something felt off. I stumbled out of bed, trying to shake off the feeling. It was just a dream, just a dream. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in my gut that something was waiting. Waiting for me to open the door. Waiting for me to listen. That morning, I decided to leave the house for a while. I went out to explore the town, to clear my mind, to pretend like everything was normal. As I walked down the quiet streets, trying to lose myself in the simplicity of the day, I couldn't help but think about Mrs. Gardner. The way she looked at the house, the way she had seemed so uncomfortable. I found her sitting on her porch when I walked by. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition or maybe something more. She waved me over. "Back again so soon?" she asked, her voice kind but edged with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded. Just needed a walk. Clear my head. She studied me for a moment, then looked back toward the house. "You know," she said, her voice low, "people don't stay in that house for long. Not after they start hearing things." I frowned, not sure if I should respond. "What kind of things?" She leaned in closer, as though sharing a secret, though her voice remained steady. "You ever wonder why the house is so cheap? Why it's been empty for so long?" She paused, her gaze flicking nervously toward the house. "The last tenants, well, they left in a hurry. They ran out, screaming about curses. And before them, there was someone who heard footsteps in the attic. Heavy ones. Almost like someone was walking with chains on their feet." I laughed, though it came out awkwardly. "You don't believe that, do you?" Mrs. Gardner didn't smile. She just stared at me, her eyes cold and knowing. "I don't believe in coincidences. That house has a history. And sometimes the past doesn't stay buried." I didn't know what to say. I could feel a chill running down my spine, the kind of chill that makes you question whether it's the weather or something else entirely. "You'll find out for yourself," she added quietly. "You'll see." I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake her words. As I walked back to my house, I found myself looking up at it as though seeing it for the first time. It seemed darker now, like it was waiting, watching. That night, as I sat in the living room, I tried to push all the unsettling thoughts out of my head. I kept the lights on, even though the house seemed to hum with an eerie energy. It was late, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. My eyelids felt heavy, and I knew I should go to bed, but something held me there, rooted to the couch. And then it happened again. A soft tapping, faint but clear, like fingernails on wood. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat, and I slowly moved toward the sound. The tapping continued, louder now, coming from the floor above me. I took a step forward, then another, and as I reached the foot of the stairs, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door opening upstairs. I froze. The house was silent. No footsteps. No creaks. Nothing. I couldn't explain it. I should have gone upstairs. I should have checked, but my body wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The silence stretched out, long and heavy. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for what felt like hours, before I finally turned and walked back to the couch. But as I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something old, something that had been here long before I ever moved in. And somehow it knew I was here. The air felt thicker the next morning, like something was pressing down on me, keeping me from escaping. I tried to brush off the events of the previous night, but the unease lingered, curling around the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and even though I went about my daily routine, there was a constant undercurrent of dread that I couldn't ignore. I made breakfast, forcing myself to focus on the mundane tasks. As I flipped the eggs in the pan, I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners, something that hadn't been there before. The house was empty, just me in the old kitchen, the creaky floorboards, the faint smell of must that seemed to permeate everything. But it wasn't just the house that unsettled me. It was the feeling inside it. The feeling that something was waiting for me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That afternoon, I decided to do something about it. I wasn't going to sit around and let fear take over. I needed to take control. I had to know more about the house, about its history, about what I was dealing with. I headed to the local library, hoping to find something, anything, about the house. Mrs. Gardner's cryptic warnings were still fresh in my mind, and I needed answers. If there was something in the house, something that had been there long before me, I had to know what it was. The library was small, with old wooden shelves stacked high with dusty books. It smelled like paper and ink, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. I went straight to the local history section, hoping to find something on the house. I was about to give up when I found an old leather-bound book wedged between two larger volumes. It wasn't much to look at, worn, faded, with a cracked spine. But something about it caught my attention, like it had been waiting for me. I pulled it off the shelf and opened the first page. The book was filled with accounts of the town's history, but there was one chapter that stood out to me: the history of 38 Birchwood Lane. My pulse quickened as I turned to the page and I began to read. The house at 38 Birchwood Lane had been built in the early 1900s by a man named Thomas Elmsworth. He was a recluse, known to keep to himself, rarely seen in town. But there were rumors that he had a fascination with the occult. In the early years, neighbors reported strange occurrences: lights flickering in the windows at odd hours, the sound of chanting coming from within the house late at night, whispers on the wind that spoke in tongues no one could understand. Some said Thomas Elmsworth had turned the house into a place for dark rituals, that he had opened a door to something beyond this world. And then one day he disappeared, vanished without a trace. The next tenants didn't last long. They left in a hurry, abandoning everything behind. They claimed to have heard footsteps in the attic, and some swore they saw shadows moving in the corners of their rooms. One tenant even went as far as to say that they saw a figure standing at the foot of their bed one night, just before they fled the house, never to return. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I read on. The book mentioned several other tenants, each one more terrified than the last. All of them had experienced similar phenomena: strange noises, cold spots, the feeling of being watched. And each one had left without looking back. I turned the page, eager to read more, when a name caught my eye: Margaret Elmsworth. She was Thomas Elmsworth's daughter, and according to the book, she had inherited the house after her father's disappearance. Margaret was known to be a quiet, reserved woman, but there were whispers about her. Some said she had followed in her father's footsteps, dabbling in the occult herself. There were rumors that she had continued her father's work, trying to reopen the door he had once opened. Margaret Elmsworth had vanished as well, just a few months after inheriting the house. The book ended abruptly, with no further details about what happened to her or the house. I closed the book, my hands trembling. So much of what I had experienced in the house matched what I had just read: whispers, footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to pack my things and get out of there before whatever had haunted those previous tenants could get to me. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I returned the book to the shelf, trying to calm my racing heart. As I walked out of the library, I kept my head down, trying not to let the weight of the information sink in. But it followed me, clinging to my every thought. I didn't want to go back to the house, but I knew I had to. I had to face whatever was waiting for me, whatever had been waiting for years. When I arrived back at the house, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the front yard. I hesitated for a moment, standing on the porch, before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The house greeted me with its familiar, musty smell, but something was different. The air felt heavier, charged like something had shifted. I moved through the house, trying to ignore the unease that bubbled up inside me. I didn't want to hear the footsteps, the whispers. I didn't want to feel that pressure, that weight on my chest. But as I moved through the hallway, the floorboards creaked under my feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. And then, from upstairs, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. This was real. The house was waking up. It was waiting for me. I slowly started to walk toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the top, I could hear the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the attic. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and I took another step. Then everything went quiet. The silence was suffocating, and I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. And then I heard it, soft at first like a whisper. Come closer. My blood ran cold, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was in this house wasn't just some old superstition. It was real, and it was waiting. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, every muscle in my body tense. The words, so soft, so deliberate, echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. Come closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air felt heavy, as though the house itself was holding me in place, trapping me in this moment. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound of it deafening in the quiet, but still I didn't move. It was as if I was waiting for something. Some sign, some explanation that would make it all make sense. But I knew deep down that there was no explanation. Not for this. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was coming down from the attic. My eyes darted to the attic door, which stood ajar at the end of the hall, and I felt my body begin to tremble. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could feel my pulse racing. Come closer. The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, menacing murmur that seemed to crawl under my skin. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but it came out ragged. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, to flee this place, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I stepped forward, slowly, against every instinct in my body that told me to turn around and escape. I had to know what was up there. I had to face whatever had been tormenting me, or I would never be able to leave. Each step creaked under my feet, echoing in the stillness of the house. I reached the bottom of the attic stairs, my hand hovering over the banister. The air was colder now, unnaturally so, and I could see my breath hanging in front of me like a ghost. I looked up, and the attic door creaked open wider, as though something inside was waiting for me. The dark shadows inside seemed to shift, alive with some unseen presence. Come closer. I could hear it now, coming from within the attic. The sound of something moving, scraping against the floor like it was trying to pull itself toward me. I took another step, my feet moving of their own accord, despite every ounce of fear telling me to stop. I reached the door and hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The attic was pitch dark. The air was thick with dust and the smell of something decayed, something old. The floor was covered in layers of forgotten things, boxes, old furniture, and discarded belongings. But it was the corner of the attic that drew my attention. A shadow moved in the corner, shifting just slightly. It was no longer the vague shape of a thing hidden in the dark. It was something more distinct, something humanoid. I stepped back instinctively, my heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was standing there, still as a statue, just out of the reach of the light from the hallway. And then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk, but slid toward me, dragging itself across the floor with an unnatural, jerky motion. I froze, my body paralyzed by terror. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow. This couldn't be real. I was imagining this, right? I was exhausted, stressed, overwhelmed. It had to be a trick of my mind. But it wasn't. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, an icy chill that pierced through my clothes and chilled my bones. The thing, it wasn't a person, not anymore. It had the shape of a person, but the movements, the way it twisted and jerked forward, were all wrong. It wasn't human. Come closer. The voice was unmistakable now, low and guttural, emanating from the figure itself. But it wasn't just the words that struck me. It was the sound of something else too, something wet like the dragging of skin on wood. And then the figure stopped. It was right in front of me. I could feel the oppressive weight of its presence, as if it were breathing down my neck, even though I couldn't see its face. The darkness shrouded it, making it impossible to see more than the outline of its form. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. I was locked in place, as though some invisible force had me trapped. The thing was waiting, watching. The air grew colder still, and I felt a sharp pressure on my chest like something was pushing against me from all sides. I gasped for breath, struggling to take in enough air, but it felt as though the very air itself had turned thick and suffocating. I turned my head, desperate for something to break the silence, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the presence of that thing in front of me. Suddenly, it lunged. I don't know how I managed to react, but I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over themselves as I scrambled toward the stairs. The thing didn't follow me, but I could hear it. Its dragging movements, its terrible breathing, the sound of it coming closer but always staying just out of reach. I didn't stop running until I was back on the first floor, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the attic door shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I backed away from it, staring at the darkened hallway. For a moment, everything was still. But then I heard it again, the faintest whisper coming from behind the door. "Come closer." It was a soft, mocking tone, a promise that I couldn't escape no matter how far I ran. I backed up, my body pressed against the wall, and I felt the cold air seeping in from every corner. The house was alive in a way that I couldn't understand, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in this house, whatever had been left behind by Thomas Elmsworth and his family, wasn't finished with me yet, and it never would be. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the closed attic door, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything, every sound, every movement, every sensation. But as I slowly sank to the floor, my hands trembling in my lap, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The house had a grip on me and I couldn't escape. I don't remember how I made it to bed that night. All I remember is the darkness. It was suffocating, like the house was swallowing me whole, and no matter how tightly I pulled the covers around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The next morning, I forced myself to get up. I needed to act like everything was normal. I needed to keep going, keep pretending I wasn't losing my mind. I brushed my teeth, made coffee, and tried to eat something. But nothing tasted right. My mind kept drifting back to the things I had heard, the things I had seen. My neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had said the house was haunted, but she hadn't mentioned anything like this. I needed to talk to her again, get some answers. Maybe there was something she wasn't telling me, something that could explain everything. I walked over to her house, my feet dragging, each step heavier than the last. When I knocked on her door, I was surprised when she answered almost immediately. Well, she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. "You don't look so good, dear. What's going on?" I need to ask you something," I said, my voice shaking despite my attempts to keep it steady. "About the house. The one I moved into. There's something wrong with it?" She raised an eyebrow. "I told you, honey, that place is cursed. If you're feeling strange, hearing things, you should leave. You don't want to mess with that place." I nodded, but I had to know more. "Cursed? What do you mean? What happened to the last people who lived there?" Mrs. Thompson's face grew darker, her lips pressed into a tight line. "They didn't last long. The last tenant. I remember hearing about him. Poor guy went mad. He was a writer or maybe a historian, something like that. Lived there for a while, but after a few months he started saying things, talking about spirits, about rituals." "Rituals?" I repeated, my stomach tightening. "What kind of rituals?" She hesitated, looking around as though checking to make sure no one was listening. "Occult stuff. He was obsessed with it. I heard rumors that he even tried to summon something. People say it didn't work out too well. The day he left, he ran out of that house in such a state, you'd think the devil himself was chasing him. He was babbling about curses and spirits, telling anyone who would listen that the house had a door to another world." "A door?" My voice barely came out above a whisper. "To another world?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Yes, a door to something dark, something that should never have been opened. He wasn't the first one to feel it. That house, it's been through more than its fair share of misery. The original owner was a strange man, obsessed with the occult. He had a lot of strange books, and people say he performed rituals in that house. But he wasn't the only one. Over the years, more people have lived there, and each one has left, changed. The house gets under your skin, you see. It feeds on your fear, on your curiosity." I felt the blood drain from my face. "And you think that's what happened to him?" "I don't know, dear," she said, her voice lowering. "But I can tell you this. The house isn't just old, and it isn't just creaky. It's alive. It's waiting for the next person to open that door again." I felt the world spin around me. A door. A doorway to something that shouldn't be here, something that had been waiting for years, maybe centuries. "Where can I find out more about it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She paused, then looked at me seriously. "You're better off forgetting what you've heard, child. Some things Some things are better left unknown. But it was too late. The door had already been opened. I had already stepped into this nightmare. That night I went back to the house. I couldn't stay away. I had to know the truth. The house was silent, eerily so. The cold air still clung to every corner, and the floorboards creaked as though the house was breathing. I made my way upstairs, avoiding the attic for now. I couldn't face whatever was up there just yet. Instead, I began searching through the rooms on the second floor. I had to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening to me. I opened every drawer, flipped through old books, and searched every closet. But it wasn't until I entered the master bedroom that I found it. A journal buried beneath a stack of old papers. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I blew the dust off the cover. The leather was cracked and worn, but the pages inside were still legible. The journal belonged to Thomas Elmsworth, the original owner of the house. I opened the first page and began reading. October 3rd, 1881. The rituals are progressing. I can feel the power growing with each passing day. The house, it is alive. It whispers to me at night, urging me to open the door. But I know it is not yet the right time. I must wait. I flipped through the pages, reading entries that grew darker with each one. Descriptions of rituals, of ancient symbols, of sacrifices made in the name of summoning something from beyond. The further I read, the more I could feel the weight of his obsession, his descent into madness. October 12, 1881. The door, it is almost ready. I can feel it calling to me. The spirits are restless. They demand release. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just some haunted house. This was a place where something had been trapped. A door to something dark, something that had been waiting for its chance to escape. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face whatever it was, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't done with me yet. And now neither was I. I barely slept that night, the weight of the journal's contents pressing down on my mind. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the wind outside seemed like a reminder of what I had read. The door Thomas Elmsworth had spoken of. I could feel it in my bones. The sense that something was waiting just beyond the edge of my understanding, something that only needed a little push to make its presence known. Morning came too quickly. I had no answers, only more questions. I had to find out where the door was, but part of me was terrified to know. The rational side of me, what little remained, urged me to leave, to walk away from this madness before it consumed me. But I couldn't. The curiosity had taken root, burrowing deep inside me. The house had already taken too much from me. I couldn't leave now. I spent the morning searching the house again, this time with a focus that bordered on obsession. I searched every room, every corner, hoping to find some clue as to where the door was, the one that Elmsworth had mentioned. But there was nothing. No hidden passage, no strange markings on the walls, nothing to suggest that there was something supernatural at work here. Still, I knew in my gut that the door was real. It had to be. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somewhere in this house, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like a year. The house seemed to grow more oppressive with every passing second. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here. That whatever Elmsworth had opened all those years ago was still lurking in the dark corners, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every moment. By the time evening came, I was at my breaking point. The exhaustion had taken its toll on me both physically and mentally. I couldn't think straight anymore. All I could focus on was the sense of being watched, the feeling of invisible eyes on me following my every move. I hadn't even realized it was nightfall until the house went eerily quiet. The usual creaks and groans of the old building had stopped. No footsteps. No wind howling outside. The silence was suffocating, unnatural. And then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable. The soft shuffle of footsteps coming from upstairs. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and there was no way I could have missed the sound of a door opening. It had to be coming from the attic. The thought of going up there, of confronting whatever was waiting, made my blood run cold. But I couldn't turn back now. I had to know. I had to face it. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, each step seeming louder than the last. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The sound had stopped, but the air felt thick, heavy with the kind of silence that made everything feel wrong. I reached for the handle, and before I could even turn it, the door swung open by itself. I gasped, stepping back as the darkness inside swallowed up the light from the hallway. A chill ran through me as I peered into the blackness. I could feel something in there, something that wasn't human, something ancient and malevolent. But I couldn't see it. It was just out of reach, hiding in the dark, watching me. My breath hitched in my throat, but I forced myself to move forward into the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the old wooden beams above creaked as though the house itself was groaning under the weight of what had been hidden here for so long. As I stepped deeper into the attic, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A strange symbol carved into the floorboards. I kneeled down, my hand trembling as I traced the edges of the mark. It looked almost like a pentagram, but it was distorted, twisted. And at the center there was a small circle like a door. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, as though something inside me was being pulled toward that symbol. The air grew colder and I could hear a faint whispering sound like distant voices calling my name. But when I turned around, no one was there. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The door. The door that Elmsworth had spoken of. It wasn't on the wall like I had expected. It was beneath the floorboards, hidden away as though it had been waiting for me to find it. I knew without a doubt that I had found it. The door to whatever lay beyond this world. And I could feel it pressing against my skin, begging to be opened. But then something snapped. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The house began to shake, the walls groaning as though they were alive, as though they were trying to push me away, to keep me from unlocking the door. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out for support, but there was nothing to hold on to. The darkness in the attic seemed to stretch, reaching out for me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to leave before it was too late. I turned and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, my chest heaving with panic. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, but when I turned, no one was there. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in the doorway, but eventually I gathered enough strength to move. I couldn't stay here any longer. The house was alive and it was pulling me in, feeding off my fear. I grabbed my coat, slammed the door behind me, and ran out into the night. As I looked back, I could have sworn I saw something in the window, a figure just standing there watching me leave. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was still there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still calling me, even now, even as I stood outside, the chill of the night air biting at my skin. Whatever was inside that house wasn't finished with me yet, and I wasn't sure I would ever be free. I thought running would help. I thought leaving that cursed house behind would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The darkness, the whispers, the sense that something was following me, it didn't stop. It wasn't bound by the walls of that house. No, whatever I had awakened there had followed me, seeping into the cracks of my mind, lingering just behind me no matter where I went. The first few days after I left were an odd blur of confusion and dread. I stayed at a small motel just outside town, my mind racing with thoughts of the house, of the door, of what I had found and what I hadn't. Every night, the same nightmare haunted me. I was back in the attic, standing before that cursed symbol, feeling the weight of the door pulling me toward it. But I could never open it. Something held me back, something unseen, something worse than any nightmare. I tried to rationalize it, convince myself that the house's influence was simply in my head, that it was the stress of the move, the pressure of my life spinning out of control. But deep down I knew better. The house had changed me. It had left its mark on me. A few days after I left, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't stop the feeling of being watched. It was like the walls themselves were closing in on me. And it wasn't just in my dreams. It was real. I could feel it, that cold presence that lingered just behind me in every corner of every room. I'd hear footsteps in the hallways of the motel, but when I opened the door, no one was there. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and trembling, hearing a soft tapping against the walls as though someone was trying to get in. The cold air in the room would grow thick, heavy, as if something were pressing down on me. One night, the silence broke. I had been drifting in and out of sleep, my eyes heavy, when I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? I hadn't seen anyone else in the hallway. No one had come near my room. I sat there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. Another knock, louder this time, and then the voice, soft, faint, but unmistakable. "Come back," it whispered. "Come back to the house." I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to open the door, but the voice, that low, beckoning tone, it was irresistible. The urge to obey, to go back, to confront whatever had followed me, was too strong to resist. I grabbed the door handle, my hand shaking. I paused. The moment stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then I yanked the door open, expecting, what? I don't know. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty hallway stretching on into the darkness. I could feel it though. Something. A presence just beyond the threshold, watching me, waiting. I slammed the door shut, heart racing, hands clammy. I backed away from it, my mind spinning. The motel room felt smaller now, suffocating. I could still hear it, the tapping. The soft, rhythmic knock at the door. But it wasn't the door anymore. It was inside my head. The house's voice calling me back. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house. The attic. The door. And the whispers. They were there too, everywhere, calling to me. It was no longer just a house, no longer just a place. It had become part of me. Part of my mind. The next morning I packed my things. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't stay anywhere, not while this thing was with me. I had to go back. I had to finish what I had started. I drove back to the house. The sun was setting as I approached, casting long shadows across the empty streets. It was as if the town had forgotten that I had ever left, as though no one cared. The house stood in the distance, silent, waiting for me to return. I parked outside, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside right away. Something was different. The air felt thick, heavy. It smelled like something was rotting, something long forgotten. I could feel the weight of the house bearing down on me, like a dark cloud pressing against my chest. I walked up the steps slowly, each creak of the wooden boards beneath my feet echoing in the quiet. The door was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me to return. I stepped inside. The house was darker than I remembered. The air inside was stale, musty, as though it hadn't been opened in years. The walls seemed to close in around me, pressing me into the narrow hallway. And the whispers. They were louder now, almost deafening. I could hear them from every corner, from the floors, the ceiling, the very walls themselves. They were calling me, beckoning me forward. I made my way up to the attic. The door was still there, just as I had left it. But this time I didn't hesitate. I knew what I had to do. I opened it. The darkness inside swallowed me whole. The air was colder now, thick with the presence of something ancient, something powerful. And in the center of the room, the symbol on the floor was glowing faintly, as though it had come to life, pulsing with a strange energy. I stepped toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was there, beneath the floorboards, just as I had seen it before. But this time there was no hesitation. I reached down, my fingers trembling as I touched the edge of the floorboard. And then it happened. The house groaned, the walls shaking violently. The air grew so cold I could see my breath, misting in front of me. I felt something brush against my skin, something cold and slick. The whispers were deafening now, no longer just voices, but a roar, a sound like the wind, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. I pulled at the floorboard with all my strength, my muscles straining. And then I saw it. The door. The edges were glowing now, brighter than ever before, as though it were alive, as though it were calling to me, pulling me in. I couldn't stop myself. I had to open it. I had to. The door swung open. And that was when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for me. But this wasn't a person. It was something else, something I couldn't understand. Its shape was wrong, twisted. Its eyes gleamed with malice, and its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too inhuman. I screamed, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer in the attic, no longer in the house. I don't know how long I was out, but when my eyes fluttered open, I found myself lying on the cold, cracked floor of what appeared to be a different room. I sat up, my head spinning, my body aching. The air felt damp, and I could smell the unmistakable stench of mildew, like the room hadn't seen sunlight in years. I wiped the sweat from my brow, taking shallow breaths as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I been knocked out? Did I pass out from fear? But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. I had opened the door. I had seen the thing on the other side, and then everything went black. I stood up shakily, looking around. I was still in the house, but it didn't feel like the same house. It was different, darker, more oppressive, as if the very walls were alive with malevolent energy. The floors creaked beneath my feet as though something were watching, waiting for me to make a wrong move. There was no sound, no whispering, no eerie tapping, just an unnatural silence. The air was heavy, thick with tension. I felt a knot form in my stomach, the kind of knot that only came when I was close to something I shouldn't be, something that shouldn't exist. I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a whisper. It felt as if the very air was suffocating me, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The room I was in looked like some kind of storage room, crates piled high, old, dusty furniture pushed into corners. The walls were lined with cobwebs, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of grime. But what caught my eye was the journal lying on the floor in the center of the room, half open, its pages yellowed with age. I couldn't help myself. My feet moved toward it, almost as if they had a mind of their own. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, thick with an oppressive force that weighed down on me. I bent down and picked it up, flipping it open to the first page. The handwriting was shaky, erratic, as if written in a hurry, in desperation. Asterisk, the door is always hungry. It waits for someone to open it. But once it's opened, there's no going back, asterisk. I shuddered, my pulse quickening. This wasn't a diary. It was a warning. A warning from someone who had gone through the same thing I was experiencing. I flipped through the pages, each one more frantic than the last, filled with ramblings about rituals, doors, and someone lurking behind them. The words were filled with panic, terror. The writer spoke of a curse that could never be broken, a curse tied to the house and the door. Asterisk, I tried to destroy it. I tried to burn the house down, to erase everything. But the house is always hungry. It consumes, it grows, and it waits for the next fool who comes to open the door, asterisk. The handwriting became more erratic as I reached the last page. It was nearly unreadable now, scrawled in a wild frenzy. Asterisk, it's here. It's in the walls. It's coming for me. It knows I can't stop it. The door is open. It's too late, asterisk. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. The silence was suffocating now, the weight of the room pressing in on me. I felt like I was drowning, like the very air was closing around me. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. I didn't care what I had to do, but I had to get out. I turned, ready to bolt, but that's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from the walls. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, sharper, as if whatever was inside the walls was trying to break through. I backed up, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The scratching stopped, but the air grew colder. And then I felt it, something behind me. Something standing just outside my line of sight. I froze, afraid to turn around, afraid to see what was there. But I had to. I couldn't just stand there. I slowly turned, my body stiff with fear. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. It wasn't the same as before. This time it was clearer, more defined. A tall, dark silhouette, its features hidden in shadow, but its eyes were glowing. They gleamed like two tiny, malevolent embers in the dark. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, feeling my every breath, my every movement. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once, but one thing stood out among them all. I was not alone. I tried to back away, but the figure stepped forward, its presence so overwhelming that I felt like I was being crushed under its weight. It was as though the very air was charged with a terrible energy, pushing me back, making it hard to move. And then I heard its voice, soft, unyielding. Asterisk, you shouldn't have opened it. Asterisk. The words were more than just words. They were a command. A truth I had known all along but refused to face. The door, the house, the curse, it was all connected. And now there was no escape. The room started to spin. The walls closed in and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. I could feel my limbs growing heavier, as if something were pulling me down, dragging me into the darkness. The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on mine, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The room fell silent again. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. I had seen it, whatever it was. Whatever had been behind that door, whatever had been waiting for me, was now inside the house. Inside me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as I was away from that cursed place. Away from that thing. But I could still feel its presence, the cold, oppressive weight pressing against me. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. And as I left the house behind, the whispers followed. They were always there, lingering in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that I had opened something that should have stayed closed. The door wasn't just in the house. It was inside me, and no matter where I went, it would always be there. Waiting. I didn't sleep for days after that. The first night away from the house, I locked myself in a hotel room, shaking uncontrollably, trying to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes, felt that cold, suffocating presence closing in on me. I could still hear the scratching from the walls, the voice that whispered my name. I couldn't escape it no matter how hard I tried. I left the hotel the next morning. The sunlight felt like a cruel joke, blinding me as I walked out into the world, trying to pretend like everything was normal. I was back in the real world. The house was behind me, but something inside me had changed. That thing, that force, it had followed me. And I knew it wasn't going to stop until it had me completely. I drove for hours, hoping that putting distance between myself and the house would help. I didn't know where I was going, just away. I stopped at a small town, rented a cheap apartment, and tried to rebuild my life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for me to return. That's when the dreams started. They began as vague, disjointed images. Faces I didn't recognize. A door that I couldn't quite see, but I knew it was there. Then over time, the dreams became clearer, more vivid. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that the thing was standing just outside my bedroom door. But when I checked, nothing was there. The more time passed, the worse it got. I couldn't focus on anything. My work, my health, my relationships, everything began to fall apart. I couldn't sleep without that feeling creeping up on me, that coldness in the back of my mind, that whisper just beyond the reach of my hearing. And then it happened. It was a quiet night, the kind of night where the world outside felt still, almost peaceful. I had just finished dinner and I was watching TV in my living room, trying to distract myself from the constant gnawing fear in my chest. Then I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the branches of a tree brushing against the glass. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up, my heart thundering in my chest, and walked toward the window. Outside, the street was empty, bathed in the dim light of the street lamp. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the window, but I knew something was out there. I could feel it. I hesitated for a moment before slowly pulling the blinds open. There was nothing. No one. Just the empty street, the shadows stretching long under the faint light. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned away from the window, I felt a chill settle in the room. The air grew heavy, and for a split second I thought I saw something. No, someone, standing in the corner of the room just outside the reach of the lamp's glow. I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, but again, nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the door, my mind racing, but when I reached for the handle, I froze. It was locked. The door was locked from the inside, and I had been alone all night. My heart skipped a beat. The room was silent again, but the oppressive feeling hadn't lifted. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the very air growing thick with the weight of whatever was in the house with me. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that place, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned, the weight lifting ever so slightly, but it was still there, lingering in the corners of my mind. I tried to sleep that night, but the fear wouldn't leave me. I lay awake, listening to the faint creaking of the building, the occasional hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I could feel my eyes getting heavier, the exhaustion pulling me under, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door. The one in the house. The one I had opened. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the thought that it had opened something in me, something that was now following me wherever I went. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My thoughts kept drifting back to the house, to the journal, to the figure in the doorway. I knew I had to face it. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I had to go back. But the house had changed. It was different now, even though I hadn't set foot in it for weeks. The memories of what I had seen in that attic, of what I had felt, those didn't fade. They grew stronger, louder, until they drowned out everything else. I couldn't escape it. I knew I was never truly free. The door was always open, and it was waiting. I didn't go back immediately. I should have. Maybe I could have finished it, but I couldn't bring myself to face the house again, not yet. So I spent the next few weeks lost in the fog of my own mind, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling at the back of my neck, that ever-present awareness that something was always watching. The cold breath at my shoulder, the eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It wasn't just in my head, though. The dreams kept coming, worse than before. The shadowy figure, the cold presence, it became more vivid every night. It would stand by my bed watching me. Sometimes it would speak, but I couldn't make out the words. I could only feel the weight of its gaze. And then it would touch me. Its cold, clammy fingers brushing against my skin, its breath, like a soft, wet whisper against my ear. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. Not to face it, not to fix what I had opened, but to understand it. To make sense of the nightmare I had trapped myself in. I gathered my things, drove back to the town where the house stood, and parked in front of it. The house looked the same, but there was something different now. Something darker, more oppressive. It stood there like an old sentry waiting for me to return. The front door was open. I could see it from where I stood, the dark hallway beckoning. It was as if the house had been expecting me all along, and now that I was back, it had no intention of letting me leave again. I stepped inside. The air was musty like old wood and dust, but there was a faint, bitter smell that I couldn't quite place, something metallic, almost sour. It was the same as it had been before, but more intense now, as if the house itself had absorbed the fear, the dread, and it was leaking it back out at me, flooding the space with its heavy presence. I moved slowly through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house seemed emptier now, more hollow, as though it had been drained of life. I could still hear the creaking of the floorboards under my weight, but it was different. It felt deliberate, almost mocking. I made my way upstairs, the feeling growing stronger with each step. The door to the attic was still closed, the lock in place, but I knew what was behind it. I knew what I had opened. But the journal? I had to find the journal. I had to understand the rituals, the curse, the reason behind all of this. I reached the door, but as I touched the handle, the temperature in the room dropped. The air turned frigid, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I hesitated, my hand trembling, but I forced myself to turn the knob. The attic was dark, but the dim light from the hallway crept in through the cracks in the walls. I moved carefully, my footsteps careful as I made my way to the old chest in the corner, the one I had seen in the journal, the one that seemed to call to me in my dreams. When I opened it, the smell hit me. It was the same smell, the one I couldn't place, the metal, the rot. But now it was mixed with something else, something sharper, something more alive. The journal was there, resting on top of old clothes and broken furniture. It looked different now, aged, brittle, like it had been waiting for me all along. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers touched the cover, a jolt of cold shot through me, like a shock that rattled my bones. I opened it. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. The handwriting was frantic, disjointed, almost as if the writer had been trying to write faster than their mind could follow. It told the story of the house's original owner, a man named Edward Blake, obsessed with the occult. He had spent years conducting rituals, trying to open a door to another world, a world beyond our own. He believed that by crossing over he could gain unimaginable power. But something went wrong. The door had opened, but not in the way he expected. Whatever came through wasn't something he could control. It began to consume him, twist his mind, until he was no longer human. He became something else, something darker, more twisted. The journal was filled with warnings, scribbled frantically across the pages. Blake had tried to seal the door, but he had failed. And in doing so, he had cursed the house. The evil that had come through never truly left. It had stayed, feeding off the fear, the suffering, the souls of those who lived there. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the last few pages. Blake had written one final entry before he disappeared, about the thing that had been haunting the house. He had warned anyone who found the journal not to stay, not to try to fight it. He had left a message: it never leaves. It waits. I slammed the journal shut, the cold settling into my bones, and looked around the attic, the walls closing in on me. The air was thick, and for a moment I could hear something, soft whispers like voices calling to me from the dark corners of the room. I turned to leave, but before I could move, the door slammed shut. The house shook with a low, guttural growl, and I knew deep in my gut that I had made a terrible mistake. I had returned, and now there was no escaping. The thing that had been waiting, watching, was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was here, and it was coming for me. The floorboards creaked beneath me as something stirred in the darkness, and I knew, whatever had been unleashed in this house, whatever Edward Blake had summoned, it was never going to let me go. The air in the attic turned thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the house itself. The whispers in the corners grew louder, curling around me like fingers reaching from the shadows. They were so close, too close. I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck, cold and wet, like something just behind me was waiting to sink its teeth in. I spun around, panic seizing me, but there was nothing but the darkness. My heart raced, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet refused to move. The door was locked, and the house had already claimed me. It was like the walls themselves were alive, pushing me into the center of the room where the air grew colder by the second. My hands trembled as I reached for the journal again, but I couldn't make sense of the words. My vision blurred, the letters twisting on the pages as the house seemed to shift around me. I needed to get out, but how? The whispers came again, clearer now. You shouldn't have come back. I froze. The voice was low and guttural, a rasping sound that seemed to come from all around me. It wasn't human. I knew that with every fiber of my being. Leave while you can, it hissed. Before it's too late. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice caught in my throat. My body wouldn't obey me. It was like the house had taken control, like it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. I slammed the journal shut, clutching it to my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave before the floor creaked. It wasn't just the usual creaking of an old house settling. This was deliberate. Heavy footsteps echoed through the attic, slow and measured, as if someone, or something, was moving toward me. I spun around, eyes darting across the room. But there was nothing. Nothing except the growing sense of dread that suffocated every breath I took. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, elongating, reaching for me, wrapping around me like cold, clammy hands. The footsteps stopped. A chill ran down my spine. And then it came. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was more like a presence, like something was suddenly there, standing behind me, just out of sight. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating, like it was studying me, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The very thought of facing whatever was behind me was enough to paralyze me. I could feel the weight of its stare pressing into me, digging into my soul. And then, without warning, the room went cold, so cold that I could see my breath in front of me, thick and white, like the temperature had dropped below freezing. The shadows grew darker, more intense, until the whole room felt like it was being swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, whatever was standing behind me. It was there, in the room with me, and it wasn't alone. There were others. I could feel them, lurking in the corners, waiting for their chance to strike. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, overlapping and distorting, until they became a maddening buzz in my ears. "Leave," they whispered, "leave now." I tried to move, tried to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my feet frozen to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. Something brushed against my arm. It was ice cold, like a hand, no, like fingers, long and thin, pressing into my skin, sending a wave of terror through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The fingers tightened. I was suffocating. Then a voice, deep, grating, spoke directly into my mind. "Did you think you could escape?" I screamed then, the sound finally breaking free, but it was drowned out by the force of the darkness surrounding me. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin, the walls bending and twisting as though they were alive, warping around me. I could feel it, the thing that had been waiting all this time. It had found me, and it wasn't letting go. With a desperate, final surge of strength, I forced myself to turn, to look behind me. But there was nothing. Just the shadows. Just the oppressive darkness. And then I saw it. The door, the one that had been locked, had opened. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care what I was leaving behind. I just ran blindly, stumbling down the stairs, my feet pounding on the creaky floor, my breath ragged and frantic. I could hear it behind me, the footsteps, the scraping, the sound of something heavy following me, chasing me. I reached the front door and threw it open, spilling into the night air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran into the street, away from the house, away from whatever had been haunting me. The cold night air felt like a slap to my face, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating grip of the house. I kept running until my legs burned, until I could no longer hear the footsteps behind me, until the house was nothing but a distant shadow in the dark. I never went back. I couldn't. But even now, I hear it sometimes, the whispers in the dark, the sound of footsteps behind me, the cold breath on my neck. It's always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for me to forget, waiting for me to go back. And I know deep down that I never truly left. The house is still with me, always. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. No matter how exhausted my body felt, my mind wouldn't allow me to close my eyes. The terror from the attic, from the shadows and the whispers, was still fresh, raw in my memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the darkness closing in on me, the cold fingers pressing against my skin. I could feel it even now, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. It was like the house had marked me, branded me in some way that I couldn't explain. I tried to tell myself that it was just the stress, the trauma of everything I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. The house, whatever it was, had followed me, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I moved into a small apartment a few miles away, hoping the distance would offer me some peace. But peace was an illusion. I felt it there too, the presence. It was faint at first, just the occasional cold spot, a flicker of shadow at the edge of my vision. But it didn't take long before the old house's grip began to tighten once more. I would wake up in the middle of the night, certain I had heard footsteps in the hallway, the distinct sound of someone, or something, moving just outside my bedroom door. I would lie there, frozen, heart hammering in my chest, unable to move, too terrified to even breathe. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, there were no creaky floorboards here, no strange noises in the walls. The apartment was newer, safer. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. And then one night it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, but this time they were different. They were heavy, deliberate, like something dragging itself across the floor. I tried to ignore it, to pull the covers over my head and pretend it wasn't happening. But the sound grew louder, closer. I opened my eyes. A figure stood at the foot of my bed. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the darkness. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of terror. And then I heard it, a whisper. "Why did you leave?" The voice was low, guttural, like something not quite human. It sent a shiver down my spine, freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey me. I was trapped, paralyzed, unable to escape. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the floor, crawling up the walls. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath in front of me. I could feel it. Its presence was suffocating, oppressive, like it was filling the room with its dark energy. "Come back," it whispered again. "Come back and finish what you started." The words sent a jolt of panic through me, and I finally found the strength to move. I shot up out of bed, stumbling backwards, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't follow, but the shadows lingered, stretching toward me, pulling me back. I ran for the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But when I turned it, the door wouldn't open. I twisted and pulled, but it was as if the door had fused to the frame, refusing to let me escape. I looked back. The figure was gone, but the room was suffocating, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Suddenly there was a noise behind me. A knock. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then the knock came again, louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the room, from the walls, from the ceiling. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my body shaking. I turned slowly, afraid to look, but knowing I had no choice. The walls were moving. The shadows were alive, crawling, twisting, and writhing like something had woken up inside them. The knocking continued, louder now, as if something was trying to break free. I ran. I don't know how, but I did. I pushed through the door, ran out into the hallway, and bolted down the stairs. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. I fled into the streets, the night air cold against my skin, my breath coming in short gasps. But even as I ran, I could still hear it. Those footsteps, echoing in the distance, always behind me, never far enough away. I moved in with a friend the next day, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that it was over. But I knew better. Whatever was in that house, whatever had followed me, wasn't finished with me. I could feel it now, just beyond the edge of my perception. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold touch on my skin. It was still out there, waiting for me, and no matter how far I ran, I would never truly escape. Because the house was still with me, and it always would be. Story 2. The house was everything I didn't expect, and yet exactly what I needed. At least that's how I convinced myself as I stood on the porch, taking in the faded blue paint peeling from the wooden frame. It wasn't a mansion by any means, but it was more than enough for me, a newly divorced woman trying to rebuild her life. The place had been on the market for months, and I was the only one to show any interest. When I first walked through the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The floors creaked beneath my feet, the air was stale, and there was this musty smell that clung to the walls. But it was cheap. And in my new life, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I set down my boxes and began to unpack, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The house had character, I told myself. That's what I kept repeating as I explored each room. The kitchen had a quirky charm with its old cabinets and vintage stove. The living room had a large, uncomfortable-looking armchair, perfect for reading. And the bedroom, well, it was small but cozy enough. Just enough space for me to forget about the chaos of the past. It wasn't long before I met Mrs. Hollis, the neighbor next door. She had been watching me from her front yard, and after some polite small talk, she invited me over for tea. Her house was nearly identical to mine, old, creaky, and full of charm, except it looked a little better kept, like someone still cared about it. "You've moved into that place, huh?" she asked, her eyes scanning the house with something like pity. Interesting choice. I frowned, unsure of what she meant by that. "It's a good price, and it's in a quiet neighborhood." "Oh, it's quiet all right." "Too quiet, if you ask me," she said, her voice dropping low, as if she didn't want anyone to overhear. You ever hear anything strange at night? I raised an eyebrow. Strange? She leaned closer, her wrinkled hands gripping her teacup tightly. The last tenants left in a hurry. Rumor has it they were hearing things, footsteps, whispers, odd noises that never stopped. Some even say they saw something that shouldn't be there. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if she was just trying to scare me, but something about her tone made me uneasy. What kind of things? Mrs. Hollis didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip from her teacup before finally replying, "People talk. They say that house is cursed. It's been empty for a long time now and no one stays too long. That's all I'm gonna say." I tried to laugh it off, but something in my chest tightened. "I'm sure it's just old house stuff," I said, as if convincing myself more than her. "Well, good luck then," she said, her smile thin. "Hope you sleep well." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I unpacked the rest of my things, arranged a few photos on the walls, and tried to get used to the creaks and groans of the house. It wasn't uncommon for an old place to settle, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed things that didn't quite add up. The floorboards creaked, sure, but there were times when the sounds felt deliberate. Like someone, or something, was walking around upstairs just out of sight. I paused, listened, but it would stop just as quickly as it started. The first night was the worst. I lay in bed, the covers pulled up tight around me, the silence pressing down on the room. It was nearly midnight when I heard it, soft, steady footsteps on the stairs. Slow and deliberate, each footfall sending a chill crawling up my spine. My heart raced and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, unmistakable this time, heavy and slow, coming from above. Someone was walking around up there, but I was alone in the house. My pulse quickened, my throat dry as I sat up in bed, the dark corner of the room casting long, eerie shadows. The sound continued for what felt like forever, and then, silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the lights on, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that someone, was out there. The next morning, I dismissed it. I had to. I couldn't let myself get paranoid in a place that wasn't even mine yet. I chalked it up to the old house settling, or maybe it was the wind making the floorboards creak. Nothing more. But the noises didn't stop. Every night, like clockwork, they would return. The footsteps, the creaking, the whispers. Sometimes it was in the kitchen, other times upstairs, but always at night when the house was still and the world was asleep. I started to wonder if Mrs. Hollis wasn't just gossiping. Maybe there was something to her story after all. Maybe there was something about this house that wasn't quite right. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know, but I couldn't ignore it. The feeling, the unease, it grew with each passing day. It was like the house was alive, watching me, waiting for me to uncover the truth. And so I would. The next few days felt like a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just wrong with the house, but I tried to brush it off. I had enough on my plate, adjusting to my new life, getting settled in a town I didn't know, and, of course, trying to forget about the past. This house was supposed to be my fresh start. But the creaks, the footsteps, the whispers in the walls, none of that was helping. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I kept myself busy, unpacking, making the house feel more like home. I hung pictures on the walls, set out candles on the mantel, and even arranged the old furniture in a way that gave the place some personality. It was cozy in a way. Still, something about the house felt off. One evening, I went to the small corner store down the street to buy some groceries. It was only a couple of blocks away, and I found myself trying to enjoy the quiet walk. The sky was overcast, the air damp, but it was peaceful. Nothing like the eerie atmosphere I'd felt at the house. Maybe I was just overthinking things. After all, the house was old, right? Old houses had quirks, and sometimes those quirks could mess with your mind. When I returned, Mrs. Hollis was sitting on her porch, watching me from across the street. She waved as I walked up, her face tight and unreadable. "Hello again," she called out, her voice a little too loud. "You doing okay in there?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just getting used to the place, you know?" She narrowed her eyes at me, her smile fading. "I can't say I'm surprised," she muttered, almost to herself. "You know, I had a friend who lived there a few years ago. He never lasted long. Left in a hurry, he did." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't like where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean, left in a hurry?" Mrs. Hollis leaned forward in her rocking chair, lowering her voice. "He came to me one night just after dark. Came running down the street, half mad, his face pale as a ghost. He said he was hearing voices in the walls. Whispers like someone was talking to him, or worse, like someone was inside the house. He said the house was cursed, that it had been haunted for decades. But no one ever believed him. He was a nervous wreck, poor thing. That was the last time I saw him. I tried to laugh it off, but my skin prickled and my pulse raced in my throat. Sounds like he was just paranoid, I said, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Hollis shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe he knew something we don't. There's a lot of history in that house, things people don't talk about. Maybe you're the one who'll find out the truth. I felt my stomach churn. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth. Not after what I had experienced already. I gave her a weak smile. Thanks for the advice, Mrs. Hollis. I'll keep that in mind. As I made my way back to the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Nothing but the stillness of the street and the overcast sky hanging low, like a curtain waiting to fall. Inside the house, the air felt heavier than usual. The creaks of the floorboards seemed louder, like the house was alive, groaning with age and secrets. I closed the door behind me, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled into my chest. That night, I decided to stay up a little later than usual. I wasn't ready to face another night of strange noises and whispers, but I didn't want to go to bed either. I sat on the couch, flipping through the channels on the TV, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting toward the stairs, the dark hallway beyond. I heard it again. The footsteps. Heavy, slow, and deliberate. They started upstairs just as they had before. One footfall after another, dragging across the floorboards like a slow, rhythmic beat. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin crawling as I listened intently, trying to determine if I was imagining it. No, it was real. I stood up, my legs trembling. My hand hovered over the light switch, but I hesitated. I didn't want to be the one to prove the house's curse true. I didn't want to find out that whatever was up there, walking around, was real. But then the sound stopped. Just like that. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and went outside, hoping the cool night air would calm my nerves. I walked across the yard and down the street, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees. The world felt distant, far away from the oppressive weight of the house. I wandered for a while, unsure of where I was going, until I found myself in front of an old cemetery at the edge of town. I hadn't noticed it when I first moved in. The tombstones were weathered, some nearly hidden beneath thick vines and moss. It was eerie, and yet there was something oddly comforting about it, maybe because it felt still, unchanging. I stood there for a long time, lost in thought, until I heard something that made me jump. A voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from behind me, from the direction of the cemetery. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there. The air was still. The trees were silent. I backed away slowly, fear creeping up my spine, until I heard the voice again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a laugh. A low, guttural sound. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that it was coming from my house. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just in my head. The sounds, the whispers, the strange feeling that I was being watched, everything had escalated to a point where I couldn't pretend it was just old house quirks. Something else was here with me. I stayed outside for a while longer, trying to gather my thoughts. The laughter echoed in my mind, unsettling in a way I couldn't shake off. It was as though the house had its own life, its own pulse, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And I did, eventually. I couldn't keep running from it. When I finally made my way back home, the sky had darkened, and the streetlights flickered on as I approached my front door. I hesitated before stepping inside, the air feeling unnaturally cold, as if it had been waiting for me. My breath hung in the air like a cloud. I was certain the house hadn't been this cold before. Inside it felt wrong. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I crossed the threshold, but this time the sound didn't feel like the house settling. It was sharper, more pronounced, as though something was moving beneath the floor. I froze in place for a moment, holding my breath, listening. The house was still, unnervingly still, except for the muffled sound of something faintly scraping against the walls from somewhere upstairs. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But it was impossible. I couldn't sleep, not with that feeling gnawing at me. The house seemed alive, restless, and it was only getting worse. The next few days felt like a blur of barely contained anxiety. I couldn't keep my mind from wandering to the things I had heard and seen. The footsteps, the laugh, the odd feeling of being watched at every corner. The house was playing with me, and I couldn't help but feel like I was losing control. That's when I decided to do something I'd been putting off. I would try to learn more about the house's history. I had to know if there was any truth to the stories Mrs. Hollis had shared, or if I was just letting my mind run wild. Maybe I could find some answers. Maybe there was something in the history of this place that could explain everything. The town's library wasn't far, tucked away in a small building at the edge of Main Street. It was an old library, the kind that smelled of must and paper, and as soon as I walked inside, the heavy scent of old books wrapped around me, calming my nerves, until I approached the desk. A man in his late 40s sat behind it, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His eyes were tired, distant, as though he'd seen 1,000 newcomers walk through that door. When I told him what I was looking for, his expression shifted. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a mix of concern and something darker. "You live in the old Weatherford house, right?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want to say it aloud. I nodded slowly. "Yes, that's the one." The man shifted in his seat, glancing around nervously. "You might want to be careful. That house has a history, one you might not want to know about." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "What kind of history?" He didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, he handed me a thick folder from beneath the counter. "Take a look for yourself," he said, his voice dropping even lower. The town's had its share of strange things happen there. I took the folder and walked to a table in the back of the library, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The first page was a newspaper clipping, dated over 30 years ago. "Strange disappearances linked to the Weatherford estate." The headline jumped out at me. The article described a series of mysterious disappearances that had plagued the house in the years following its construction. The last known tenant of the house, a man named Thomas Weatherford, had vanished under strange circumstances. Neighbors reported hearing him yelling at something, or someone, in the dead of night, but no one had seen him after that. I flipped through the pages, finding more reports of strange occurrences tied to the house. People spoke of eerie footsteps, strange lights in the windows, and sounds of chanting late at night. One account even mentioned a local woman who had seen a dark figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching her as she walked by. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. But it wasn't just the disappearances or the strange reports that caught my attention. It was something else, something that chilled me to my core. It was the mention of an occult connection. The original owner of the house, Thomas Weatherford, had been obsessed with the occult. His journals, which I found mentioned in several of the articles, detailed various rituals and ceremonies he'd conducted in the house. Rituals that involved the summoning of spirits, the opening of portals to other realms, and disturbing ceremonies meant to bend the natural world to his will. The last of his writings suggested that he had made a dangerous mistake, something that had caused him to be haunted by the very things he had tried to summon. My hands shook as I turned the pages faster, desperate to find more. The man behind the desk had mentioned that the townspeople had kept these stories quiet, but now, I was uncovering things I couldn't explain. The deeper I dug, the more I found references to a curse, one that had plagued the house for decades, passed down from one tenant to the next. And now, it seemed like I was the one who had inherited it. The room grew colder, and I realized I had been holding my breath as I read. I slammed the folder shut, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with thoughts, too many to comprehend. The rituals, the whispers, the footsteps, it all made sense now. I was living in a house that was never meant to be inhabited. A house that had been touched by something dark and supernatural. The curse was real, and now it was after me. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, but the thought of leaving the house was terrifying in itself. I wasn't sure if it would even let me go. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone. Not anymore. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go home. The weight of everything I had just uncovered was too much to process. The library had provided me with answers, but they were the kind I had hoped I wouldn't find. A house built on dark rituals and cursed history, a place inhabited by people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. How could I just go back there, knowing what I now knew? I drove around the town aimlessly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each passing minute. The streets were eerily quiet, the houses dark and uninviting. Even the moon seemed hidden behind a blanket of clouds, casting everything in shadows. The silence was deafening. I kept replaying the librarian's words in my mind. Be careful. That house has a history you might not want to know about. What did he mean by that? What kind of history was it? Was I in danger? The longer I thought about it, the more my head spun. The house had been built with intention, a design that had its roots in something far darker than I had originally assumed. And now, with every creak of the floorboards and every whisper in the shadows, I couldn't help but feel like I was a part of something much bigger than myself. Something ancient. It wasn't until I pulled into the driveway that I realized I had unconsciously driven back home. My headlights illuminated the old house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. I stopped the car, staring at it for what felt like an eternity before I finally forced myself to step out. The door creaked as I entered, just like it always did. But tonight, the sound seemed more menacing, as though the house was greeting me in a way it never had before. The air was thick, heavy with a kind of oppressive presence that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore the dread curling in my stomach as I climbed the stairs. It was late and I was exhausted, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep without confronting this fear head-on. The house had already shown me it wasn't going to leave me alone. I had to confront it. I reached the top of the stairs, my eyes scanning the dark hallway. The lights flickered briefly, casting long shadows along the walls. Every room was still, silent. But then I heard it. A soft scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. It came from behind one of the doors down the hall. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the noise. It was slow, deliberate, too deliberate to be just the house settling. It was something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. With a shaky breath, I moved toward the door. I reached out for the knob, my fingers trembling. The scraping sound stopped as soon as I touched it. I hesitated, my pulse racing, before slowly pushing the door open. The room beyond was empty, but the air inside was colder than the rest of the house, like a breeze had swept through, even though the windows were tightly shut. I stepped inside, scanning the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. It didn't take long for me to notice it. The floor. There, in the middle of the room, was a spot where the carpet had been pushed back, revealing a small section of the old wooden floor. It was worn like it had been disturbed recently. And at the edge of the wood, a faint, dark stain marked the area, one I hadn't noticed before. I bent down, my fingers hovering above the mark, but I didn't dare touch it. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me to find it. A sudden chill ran down my spine and I straightened up quickly. The room felt too close, the air too thick. My breathing quickened as I backed away from the stain, my eyes darting around in search of anything else out of place. And then I heard it again. The whisper. Faint but unmistakable. It came from behind me in the far corner of the room. Asterisk, leave now, asterisk. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty, shadowed corners of the room. I stumbled backward, my hand grabbing the door frame for support. My heart hammered in my chest and I felt lightheaded, like I was about to collapse. I had to get out of here. As I turned to leave, I heard the sound again. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hall. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. I ran. I bolted out of the room and down the stairs, my feet pounding on the wooden steps. The footsteps followed, keeping pace with me, growing louder and closer. I could feel the cold air on my neck, and the sensation of something just behind me, as though it were reaching out, ready to touch me. I made it to the front door, my hand fumbling for the knob. When I finally wrenched it open, the rush of cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath, the house looming behind me like a dark, hungry thing. I stood in the yard, trembling, my legs barely holding me up. The house stood in silence, as if nothing had happened at all. No footsteps, no whispers, just the quiet of the night. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The house had felt me, felt my fear, and now it was waiting. Waiting for me to return, for me to give in to whatever it wanted. I couldn't stay. But could I leave? I wasn't sure anymore. What if the house followed me wherever I went? I stumbled back to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. But when I glanced up, the windows of the house seemed to be watching me, dark shapes behind the glass. I drove away, but the feeling never left. That cold, oppressive presence. The sense that it was out there, waiting in the shadows. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I was ready to confront it, but I couldn't keep running forever. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single minute. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow in the corner of that room. I could still hear the whispers, feel the cold presence pressing against me. It wasn't something I could shake off, no matter how hard I tried. I kept thinking about the footsteps, the dragging noise on the floor, and the feeling that I wasn't alone in that house. By morning, I was a mess, eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep, hands trembling as I sipped my coffee. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to go back. I didn't know why, but something deep inside me told me that I wouldn't be able to move on until I did. I couldn't just leave without answers. I had already found too much to turn back now. I made my way to the library again, hoping for more information. There had to be something in those old books, something that could explain what was happening. But the librarian wasn't there. It was a different woman working the desk, a younger one with tired eyes, who barely glanced up as I entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice distant, like she had better things to do. I nodded and approached the counter. "I was looking for more information about the house on Maple Street," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The one that used to belong to Elias Blackwood." Her eyes flickered for a moment, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she reached for a book on the top shelf, one that I hadn't seen before. She handed it to me with a strange smile. "Here. You might want to read this." I took the book and glanced at the title. The Forgotten Rituals of Blackwood Manor. The spine was cracked, as if it had been opened countless times, but the pages looked well preserved. It was clear someone had been studying it for a long time. "Thank you," I muttered, feeling a sense of unease creep over me. As I sat down at a nearby table, I opened the book and began to read. The first few pages were about the history of the Blackwood family, detailing their rise to prominence in the town and their eventual decline. Elias Blackwood, the original owner of my house, had been a strange man, obsessed with the occult and the supernatural. The book mentioned rumors that he had dabbled in rituals, attempting to communicate with forces beyond this world. But it wasn't until I reached a section near the back that things took a darker turn. There, in a yellowed, handwritten note, were the details of the last known ritual performed in Blackwood Manor. It described a summoning, an attempt to open a portal to another realm. The note warned that the ritual had gone wrong, that Blackwood had unleashed something that should never have been allowed into this world. The description was vague, but the implication was clear. The house was cursed. Elias Blackwood's obsession had opened a door to something far darker, and now whatever had come through was bound to the house. The rituals, the strange occurrences, the footsteps in the night, everything made sense now. But what didn't make sense was why I was still there. Why hadn't it claimed me yet? The answer was in the final line of the note. "You cannot leave once you have seen it. The house knows your fear." I closed the book with a snap, my hands shaking. The room around me seemed to close in, the air thickening with a weight I couldn't explain. I needed to get out of here. I needed to think. I left the library in a daze, the words echoing in my mind. The house knew my fear. Was that why it had come after me? Had it sensed the fear in my heart, the same way it had sensed the other tenants before me? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I walked faster, my footsteps hurried and uneven. The whole town seemed to have grown quieter, like the people around me had vanished. It was as if I was the only one left. When I reached my car, I noticed something strange. The windows of the house on Maple Street were all dark, just like before. But this time, there was a faint light flickering in the attic window. A dim, yellowish glow that seemed to pulse in the darkness. I froze, staring at it for a long time, my breath caught in my throat. I had been in that house. I knew every inch of it. There was no way there should have been any lights on, let alone in the attic. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about the note in the book. "You cannot leave once you have seen it." The house knew my fear. And I was beginning to think it knew something more about me than I had realized. I didn't go back that night. But the next morning, I couldn't keep away. The house was calling to me again. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar chill in the air hitting me like a slap to the face. The house was still, but it felt different now, more alive, like it was waiting for me. The oppressive feeling was back, heavier than before. I walked through the house, every step echoing in the silence. I passed the room with the carpet rolled back, the spot on the floor still stained. I couldn't bring myself to go inside again, but I knew I would have to eventually. That's when I heard it. A voice. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Leave. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but no one was there. I wasn't alone anymore. I stood frozen in the hallway, the voice still echoing in my ears. I wasn't sure if I had heard it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as though the house itself was waiting for something, waiting for me to move, to react. "Leave?" The voice was clearer now, louder, as if it was coming from just behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but once again there was nothing. No one. The hallway was as empty and still as ever. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and a sense of dread washed over me. Something was in here with me. Something that wanted me to leave. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my fear getting the best of me. But deep down I knew better. The house had changed. The atmosphere was thicker, heavier. The air itself felt suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing in from all sides. I walked slowly down the hallway, my eyes scanning every shadow. The footsteps I had heard in the night, the whispers, the cold spots, it was all starting to come together. I was in a place that was never meant to be inhabited. This house had been built on something dark, something that had been waiting for someone like me to come along. As I made my way through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walls seemed to close in, the air getting colder with every step I took. I felt the familiar creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet, but it wasn't the usual creak. It was deeper, almost as if the house itself was groaning in agony. I stopped in front of the staircase, staring up at the dark, narrow hallway that led to the attic. It had been days since I last saw that light flickering in the attic window. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know what was up there. I wasn't sure why I felt this strange compulsion, but I knew I couldn't leave without seeing it for myself. Something was pulling me, urging me to go up there. I had to know what was waiting for me. Taking a deep breath, I slowly climbed the stairs. The wood beneath my feet creaked with every step as if protesting my presence. I reached the top of the stairs, my hand hovering over the door that led to the attic. The door was slightly ajar, just like before. I could see the faint light coming from within, flickering like a dying flame. It was the same eerie yellowish glow that had pulled me in the first time. I stepped forward, my body trembling, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was even colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust and the scent of something old, like mildew, like decay. The light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a moment, I just stood there, waiting for something to happen. I don't know what I was expecting, but what I saw was worse than anything I could have imagined. At first, I didn't see it. The room was empty, just old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked against the walls. But then my eyes were drawn to the far corner, where something didn't seem right. A shadow, darker than the rest, clung to the corner of the room. It moved just slightly, like it was breathing, like it was waiting for me to notice. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I took a cautious step forward. The shadow didn't move again, but I could feel it watching me, following my every movement. I reached the corner of the room and saw what it was. An old wooden chest, sitting there as if it had always been a part of the house. But it wasn't the chest that made my blood run cold. It was the symbol carved into the lid. A symbol I had seen before in the book at the library. It was the same mark that had been drawn in the journal, an ancient, twisted design, with lines that seemed to shift as I stared at them. It was the symbol of the ritual, the one Blackwood had used to open the door to whatever had come through. I reached out to touch it, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. But before I could lay a finger on the chest, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the corner of the room. I froze, my hand hovering just above the chest. The growl grew louder, deeper, more guttural. It was coming from within the walls, the floor, the air itself. It felt like the house was alive, like it was breathing, like it was waking up. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the growl stopped. I turned to leave, my heart racing in my chest, but I was stopped by something I hadn't noticed before. The door. It was slowly closing on its own, as if it had been pulled by an invisible hand. I panicked, rushing to the door, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. And then the lights went out. The attic was plunged into complete darkness. I could feel the air growing colder, the weight of something heavy pressing down on me. I reached out, my hands trembling, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like something was walking toward me in the dark. Leave. It was the voice again, the same voice that had whispered to me before. It was louder now, more insistent. It was coming from right behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only the dark, empty space of the attic. I didn't wait another second. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My fingers scrambled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel the cold breath on the back of my neck. Finally, the door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. But as I looked back, I saw something that froze me to the core. The attic door was wide open. The light was flickering again. And in the doorway, standing perfectly still, was a figure. A tall, dark silhouette, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold night air slapped against my face. My legs felt weak, like I was running through molasses, but I couldn't slow down. The feeling of being followed, of something inescapable chasing me, was overwhelming. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. I wasn't sure how long I'd been running or where I was even going. My mind was in a fog, my thoughts jumbled. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the attic doorway, those glowing eyes, the cold emptiness radiating from it. It was real. It wasn't just some figment of my imagination. I finally collapsed in a heap on the sidewalk in front of the house, gasping for air. My chest heaved, my body trembling, but even as I sat there, I knew I couldn't stay. Not in that house. Not with whatever was there. It was waiting for me. I glanced back at the house, my heart sinking. The lights were on in the attic. The window that had been dark only minutes before now glowed with an eerie yellow light. It was like the house was alive, like it was calling to me, urging me to come back. But I couldn't. I had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer. I stood shakily, my legs still unsteady beneath me. The night air felt oppressive, like the darkness itself was closing in. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it did nothing to shake the chill that had settled deep into my bones. I turned and walked down the street away from the house. But as I passed by the row of old, decaying houses, I felt the weight of something on my back. A sense of being watched, of something following me just out of sight. It was like the very air around me was thick with tension. I looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the dim street lights casting long shadows along the sidewalk. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was still there, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to turn around again. I kept walking, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get to the nearest bus stop. I needed to get as far away from that place as I could. When I reached the corner, I paused for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I looked back one last time at the house, and there it was again. The figure standing at the window, staring down at me. Those glowing eyes, unblinking, unyielding, fixed on me from the darkness. It was as if it knew exactly where I was, as if it was daring me to make a move. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't care where I was going, just as long as it was away from that house. Away from whatever was inside it. I reached the bus stop, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers were slick with sweat, my mind still reeling from everything I'd experienced. I had to leave. I had to go. The bus finally arrived, and I climbed aboard, my eyes darting nervously as I searched for an empty seat. As soon as I sat down, I pressed myself against the window, trying to get a better view of the street behind me. The house was still there, just down the road. The lights were off now, but I knew better than to trust that. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just the stress, the fear. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. The house had changed. The presence I had felt was real. The bus pulled away, and I watched the house grow smaller and smaller in the distance. But even as I left it behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I couldn't escape the sense that whatever was in that house was still out there, waiting for the next person to move in, to fall victim to its curse. I couldn't forget the whispers, the footsteps, the figure in the attic. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. It was still out there, and it was still waiting. I couldn't sleep. The bus ride had been the longest of my life, but even after I had arrived at my temporary apartment, all I could do was pace. My mind kept playing back the images of the house, of the figure in the attic, the glowing eyes that haunted me even in the daylight. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see them, those eyes watching, waiting. I hadn't gone back to the house. I couldn't. Something inside me knew that if I went back, I'd never leave again. Whatever was in that house was still there, and it was waiting for me to return. The house had marked me just as it had marked every other person who had stepped inside its walls. And there was no escaping it. I had spent the entire day trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the stress had finally taken its toll. But every time I tried to relax, I would hear something, a whisper, a creak, a soft tapping, just faint enough to make my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the house was still out there pulling me back, one thread at a time. I couldn't go back. I had to find a way to forget. The phone rang suddenly, breaking my train of thought. I nearly jumped out of my skin as I reached for it. The screen flashed with an unknown number, but something about it felt familiar, almost like a warning. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end, and then a low, rasping voice spoke. It sounded like it was coming from far away, like it had to fight through layers of static. Leave. I froze. My blood ran cold. The same voice. The same chilling tone I had heard in the house, in the attic, just before I had run out of there. It was the voice of whatever was haunting that place. Who is this? I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. "What do you want?" But there was no answer. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart racing. My hands were shaking. I had no idea who was on the other end, but I didn't need to. I knew what they were telling me. I had to leave. The house wasn't done with me yet. I dropped the phone onto the table and stood up. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too confined. The walls were closing in around me, the air thick with the oppressive sense that something was still watching. I had to get out. I had to get away from everything that had happened. The house had infected my mind and I couldn't think clearly anymore. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me down the street, away from the apartment, away from the house, but no matter how far I walked, the feeling never left. That same cold dread settled over me like a heavy fog, and I could feel the eyes on my back once again. I walked for hours, trying to outrun it, trying to put distance between myself and the house, but it wasn't enough. The further I went, the closer I felt to it, as though the very ground I walked on was tethered to that cursed place. Finally, I ended up at a park, sitting on a bench in the dark, trying to catch my breath. The city was quiet, the only sounds the occasional car passing by and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But even in this peaceful place, I couldn't escape the unease that clung to me. It was then that I noticed it, the figure standing at the far end of the park just inside the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the street lamp. But as I focused, I saw it more clearly, a tall, dark silhouette standing completely still, just watching. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same figure, the one I had seen in the attic. The same glowing eyes, burning through the darkness. It was like the night itself had brought it to life. I stood up abruptly, panic rising in my chest. I turned to leave, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they were stuck in place. I couldn't move. The figure hadn't moved, but I could feel it, as if it were pulling me toward it with invisible strings. I had to run. I had to get away. I forced my legs to move, to push forward, but as I did, the figure stepped forward, gliding effortlessly toward me. It wasn't walking. It was floating, drifting through the air as if gravity had no hold on it. I stumbled back, my breath ragged. I had nowhere to run. Leave. The voice, that same chilling whisper, came from everywhere. It surrounded me, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel it crawling into my ears, into my mind, pushing me closer to the figure. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the cold from the figure seeping into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. My vision blurred, and the world around me spun, distorting into a whirl of dark shapes and shadows. The figure stopped just in front of me. I could feel its presence like it was all around me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was frozen in place, trapped by its gaze. And then, without warning, it spoke again. You should have never come back, The words were like a physical blow, sending a wave of ice-cold fear through my entire body. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, unable to stand. My mind was screaming, my heart pounding, but all I could do was stare up at it. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity, glowing brighter with every passing second. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I couldn't. The air was thick with the pressure of its presence, and I was powerless against it. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, but I couldn't turn to look. I couldn't move. And then a voice, soft but urgent, called out from the shadows. Get out of here. Run, I didn't know who it was, but the voice cut through the suffocating silence like a knife. Without thinking, I sprang to my feet and ran, my legs moving on instinct, carrying me away from the figure, away from the park, away from the house. I didn't look back. I didn't know where I was running to, but I couldn't stop. The night seemed to stretch out before me, endless and dark, with only the sound of my own footsteps breaking the silence. I didn't dare look behind me. I couldn't. The figure in the park, the eyes, the voice, it was all too much. I felt as though the weight of it was bearing down on me, pushing me forward. I ran for what felt like hours, my breath ragged and my chest aching, but still that feeling, that presence stayed with me. It hovered just at the edge of my awareness, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. Eventually, I found myself on the outskirts of the city, far from the park, far from the house, and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that it was waiting for me to stop running. But I was too afraid to stop. My legs were screaming, my body begging me to rest, but the fear kept me moving. I stumbled onto a quiet street, the houses around me dark and silent. It was a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The kind of place where the houses were old, their yards untended, and the streetlights flickered like the neighborhood had been forgotten by time. It felt like the perfect place to lose myself. I didn't know why I thought that. I didn't know why I thought I could outrun what had followed me, but in that moment, it felt like my only choice. I paused for a moment, my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. I glanced around, looking for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No cars, no people, just the faint rustling of trees in the wind. And then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, coming closer, getting louder. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I knew it was there. I turned and ran again, this time with more urgency, more desperation. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps seemed to match my pace. Always behind me, always just out of sight. I rounded a corner, my heart pounding in my chest, and suddenly I was standing in front of a house. It looked just like the others, old, decaying, the windows dark. But this one was different. There was something about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as though it was calling to me. I didn't want to go inside. I knew I shouldn't. But I was so tired, so scared, and the fear of whatever was following me was worse than anything the house could hold. I walked slowly up the steps, my legs shaking beneath me, and reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, like it hadn't been opened in years. I turned it, and the door creaked open with an eerie groan. Inside, the house was dark, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. I stepped inside, my footfalls muffled on the old wooden floor. The silence was deafening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't know what I expected to find in that house, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the oppressive sense of something watching me from the shadows, from every corner. It wasn't the cold, creeping feeling that seemed to fill every inch of the room, seeping into my skin. I glanced around the dimly lit hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places as if the house itself were falling apart. And yet it felt alive, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the house. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, the dark shadows stretching out before me. The feeling of being watched intensified. I could feel it now, the presence in the house, the thing that was waiting for me. It was everywhere, filling the space around me, pressing in on me like the walls were closing in. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to move. I didn't know what I was running from, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I needed to leave. I turned and sprinted through the hallway, my feet slapping against the floor, my breath ragged in my throat. But no matter how fast I ran, it was always there. The footsteps, the whispering, the feeling of something just behind me, waiting for the moment when I would stop. I reached the front door, but as I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck as if someone, or something, was holding it closed. I yanked at the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't open. "Let me out." I screamed, but no one answered. Suddenly, I heard a sound that froze me in place, a low, guttural growl coming from behind me. It was deep and primal, full of malice, like an animal that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The house was empty, except for the eyes. Those eyes, glowing in the darkness, watching me. The figure was standing in the doorway, its form barely visible in the shadows. But I could see those eyes. Those damn eyes. "Leave," it whispered again, the voice cold and hollow, echoing in my mind. I didn't wait to hear more. I lunged at the door, pushing with all my strength, and finally it gave. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. But even as I ran, even as I fled from that house, I could feel the eyes on my back. I could hear the whispers in my mind, urging me to turn around, to look. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I didn't know how far I ran or how much time had passed, but eventually I found myself standing in front of an old, empty diner. The neon sign buzzed dimly above the door, flickering in the otherwise dark street. I hadn't meant to come here, but something about the quiet, familiar setting seemed to draw me in. I needed a place to think, to catch my breath, and this place, this little diner, seemed as good as any. I pushed the door open, the bell chiming softly above me. The inside was as quiet as the street outside, with only the hum of a distant refrigerator and the faint smell of stale coffee in the air. The booths were empty, save for one figure sitting in the farthest corner. I didn't recognize the man, but something about him felt off. His presence seemed to fill the room, like a heavy fog that hung in the air. His eyes, though, those cold, distant eyes, they were familiar. Like I had seen them before, in the darkness of the house, in the park, or maybe in my dreams. I sat down at the counter, not daring to glance over at him. My heart was still racing from the encounter in the house, from the feeling that something was following me, that something was waiting. I could still feel the chill in my bones, the weight of the darkness that seemed to cling to me no matter how far I ran. The waitress behind the counter gave me a half-hearted smile as she poured coffee into a chipped mug. Her eyes flicked to the man in the corner for just a second before she returned her gaze to me. She didn't say anything, but I noticed the unease in her expression, the way she avoided looking at him. I reached for the cup of coffee, my hands trembling slightly as I wrapped my fingers around the handle. The warmth of the mug did little to ease the cold that had settled in my chest, the terror that was still gnawing at the edges of my mind. It was like the events of the past few hours, no days, had erased any sense of normalcy, leaving only a hollow feeling of dread. "Are you okay?" The waitress's voice was soft, her gaze flicking back to me with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. That was the last thing I wanted to hear right now. "Just tired," I said, my voice strained. "It's been a long night." She nodded slowly, clearly not buying it, but she didn't press further. Instead, she gave me a knowing look. It was the kind of look people give when they've seen too much, when they know things they shouldn't. After a long, uncomfortable silence, the man in the corner finally spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy, but somehow it carried across the room as if it was meant for me to hear. "You can't run from it." I froze, my blood running cold. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with meaning, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. I didn't turn to face him, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into the back of my skull. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You can't outrun what you've woken up," the man continued, his voice growing more intense. "It's already here waiting. It was always waiting." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The words seemed to resonate deep within me, like a truth I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. The things I had been experiencing, the strange sounds, the cold spots, the whispers, they weren't just coincidences. They were part of something bigger, something that was now a part of me whether I liked it or not. The waitress glanced at me, then at the man, before quickly turning away to wipe down the counter. She didn't say anything, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew what he was talking about. She knew something and I could feel it. But I couldn't ask her. I couldn't bring myself to speak. "You've opened the door," the man whispered, almost too quietly for me to hear. "And now it's coming for you." A chill ran down my spine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. What did he mean by "open the door"? I didn't even know what was happening to me, how this all connected. But something in my gut told me that this man knew more than he was letting on. I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back so quickly it scraped loudly against the floor. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. I couldn't sit there anymore. I couldn't listen to him. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door, my hand gripping the handle tightly. As I pulled it open, I heard the man's voice one last time, low and steady. "Don't go back to that house. It won't let you leave." I paused for a moment, my fingers still wrapped around the door handle, but I didn't turn to look at him. I couldn't. The words hung in the air like a warning, one I wasn't sure I could ignore. I stepped outside into the cold night, the door slamming shut behind me. My breath came in short bursts and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I had to go back to the house, I knew I did. It was the only place where I might find answers, where I might understand what was happening to me. But deep down, I knew something was waiting there. Something that didn't want me to leave. Something that had been waiting for me to come back all along. I had to go back. There was no other choice. The words of that man in the diner echoed in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to confront whatever it was that had been haunting me. The house that had already cost me so much, was the only place that might hold the answers. The walk back felt like a slow, endless journey. The streets were still, the air thick with the same oppressive silence that had haunted the house. I could feel the weight of something watching me from the shadows, as if I wasn't alone on this walk. But each time I turned around, there was nothing. Just empty streets. Yet the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. As I neared the house, the front door seemed to groan in the wind, like it was calling me, beckoning me back in. I hesitated at the threshold for a moment, taking in the sight of the house again. It looked the same as it always had, creaky, old, and a little too quiet. But tonight something felt different. The air felt heavier, as if it was thick with secrets. I pushed the door open, the familiar squeak sending a shiver up my spine. The house didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. It felt like it was something else's. Something far older, far more dangerous. The first thing I noticed as I stepped inside was the smell. It wasn't just the stale, musty odor I'd grown used to. This time it was different. sharp, metallic, like something had been spilled or smeared on the walls. I couldn't tell if it was real or just the product of my mind, but it felt real. So real that I could almost taste it. I took a step forward, and immediately the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. I glanced around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. No creaks, no whispers, nothing. I made my way to the stairs, my footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. The darkness seemed to press in around me, and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. Every step felt like a risk, like a decision I couldn't take back. As I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was the faintest glimmer of light. It was coming from beneath the door to the room that had always been locked, the one that I had never dared to open. But tonight something pulled me toward it. I walked down the hallway slowly, the air growing colder with every step I took. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. For a moment, I hesitated, remembering the stories the neighbors had told me, the strange happenings, the disappearances. The idea that whatever had been left behind in this house was still lingering, waiting. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in protest. The room was bathed in a strange, dim light, as if something was casting a glow from within. But there was nothing in the room. Just the same furniture I had seen before, the old, dust-covered chairs, the bed with the sagging mattress, and the small window looking out over the street. But on the floor near the center of the room was something new. A circle, drawn in what looked like chalk or ash. It was large, almost too large for the room, and its intricate lines seemed to stretch across the floor, snaking out in every direction like a spider's web. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread creeping up my spine. The air around me grew thick with an energy I couldn't describe, something ancient, something alive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I bent down to get a closer look. And then I saw it. At the center of the circle, there was a small, weathered book, its pages yellowed with age. It was lying open, as if it had been waiting for me. I reached down slowly, my hands trembling as I picked up the book. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was filled with more than just paper. More than just words. The pages were filled with strange symbols, ones I didn't recognize. Diagrams, sketches, and something that looked like a map. But the further I flipped, the more I began to understand. It was a journal, written by the house's original owner, the man who had been obsessed with the occult, with rituals, with things that should never be touched. His words were scattered across the pages, fragmented and disjointed, as if his sanity had slowly unraveled over time. But there was one phrase that stood out, written over and over again like a mantra. Asterisk, the door is open. The door is always open, asterisk. My breath caught in my throat as I read those words again. The door. The door he had opened. The door I had unknowingly walked through. Suddenly the room seemed to grow colder. The air around me thickened as if something was beginning to stir. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, like they were alive, waiting. I stood up quickly, clutching the book to my chest. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming from behind me. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The air was thick with a presence, something I couldn't see but could feel. A presence that was closing in on me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could feel them vibrating through the floor beneath me. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. And then a voice, soft, whispering in my ear. You shouldn't have come back. The words sent a wave of cold panic through me. I had no idea where the voice had come from or how it had gotten so close, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't risk it. Without thinking, I ran. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house, never looking back. The door slammed behind me with a deafening crash. I didn't stop running until I was far away, until the house was nothing more than a distant silhouette against the night sky. But even then, I could still hear it. The footsteps. And the voice. You shouldn't have come back. I didn't know where I was running anymore. I couldn't feel my legs beneath me, couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my heart. I was miles away from the house now, at least I thought I was, but every corner I turned, every shadow that passed by me felt like it was drawing me back to that cursed place. The footsteps still echoed in my ears as though they were following me, lingering just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind, that I was hearing things, but deep down, I knew better. The thing, the presence that had been inside that house. It wasn't gone. It hadn't left. It was still there and it was waiting. I stopped in the middle of the street, my breath ragged and uneven. The night was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses in on you like a heavy weight. The world felt wrong, distorted, like it wasn't entirely real. I looked around, hoping to see something familiar, but the streetlights cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for me, threatening to pull me back toward the house. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat as I unlocked it. I needed to call someone, anyone, but when I looked at the screen, the only thing that stared back at me was a blank, white screen. No signal. No connection. I could hear the wind picking up around me, rustling the leaves on the trees, but there was something off about it. The wind didn't sound like wind. It was too thick, too heavy, like it was trying to carry something dark and malevolent. I started walking again, faster this time, though I wasn't sure where I was going. My thoughts were jumbled, spinning in a chaotic whirlwind of fear and confusion. I had to get away. I had to escape the pull of that place. But every step felt wrong. Every footfall felt like it was bringing me closer to the house again. I turned the corner, my eyes scanning the street, searching for some sign of life, some proof that I was still in the real world. But all I saw was the old, weathered house, standing at the end of the street like a dark sentinel, its windows staring blankly at me. The door was wide open, like it was inviting me back. The voice, soft and insistent, whispered through my mind again. You shouldn't have come back. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave, had to get out of this town, this place, this nightmare. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the road that led out of the neighborhood. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the house stayed in the corner of my vision, always there, always watching. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when I finally reached the bus station. My mind was numb, my body moving on autopilot. I bought a ticket, boarded the bus, and sat in the farthest seat I could find. I needed to get away. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was anywhere but here. As the bus rumbled to life and pulled away from the station, I watched the town shrink in the distance. The house, its looming figure now smaller, faded into the dark horizon. For the first time in what felt like days, I could breathe. I could relax. I was free. But as the bus drove on, the shadows outside grew deeper, more oppressive. And just as I closed my eyes, hoping to find some kind of peace, I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. Louder. Heavier. And then a voice, familiar and cold, whispered in my ear as though it was sitting beside me, just out of sight. You shouldn't have come back. I opened my eyes, my heart racing, my skin crawling with a cold sweat. The bus was still moving, but everything outside had gone black. The windows were no longer showing the passing scenery. Instead, they were mirrors reflecting nothing but darkness. The only thing I could see in the glass was my own terrified face. And behind me in the reflection, there it was. The house. Standing alone in the night, its door wide open. Waiting. The footsteps came again, this time louder than ever, as if they were coming straight for me. And I knew without a doubt that it wasn't over. It would never be over. Whatever had been released in that house, whatever had been waiting for me there, it wasn't going to let me go. It would follow me, track me down, until I was just another part of its dark history. Because the door was always open. Story 3. I never thought I'd end up here. Alone in an unfamiliar town, surrounded by silence. But that's how life goes, I guess. After the divorce, I needed to escape. The house was cheap, old, but it had character, or so the realtor said. The day I moved in, the house seemed like it had seen better days. The wood floors creaked under my feet as I hauled boxes into the narrow entryway. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to make me sneeze. But there was something oddly comforting about it all, something that made me feel at ease. The house felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. The stairs leading up to the second floor groaned in protest with every step I took. The hallway was narrow, with peeling wallpaper and light fixtures that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But it was mine now. I could do what I wanted. And I did, setting up my life the way I thought it should be. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you second-guess yourself. I had expected the house to settle. Old houses do that, right? I brushed it off. But as I lay in bed that night, trying to drift off, I heard a sound. A soft, distant thump. It came from downstairs. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, but I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Maybe a floorboard had shifted. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to sleep. The next day, I met Mrs. Palmer, the neighbor from next door. She was older, wearing a faded cardigan and a pair of glasses that perched on the edge of her nose. She seemed nice at first. "Nice to meet you, dear," she said with a warm smile. "I hope you're settling in well." The house? Well, it's a bit of a handful, isn't it? I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Oh, I don't mean to scare you, she continued, lowering her voice, but you should know a little about the place. People have come and gone from that house over the years. Strange things have happened. Some people say it's cursed. I laughed it off, figuring it was just the kind of gossip that neighbors enjoy passing around. Cursed? She nodded, her eyes narrowing. There was a family years ago. They moved in, and after a few months, the father, he ran out of that house one night, babbling about footsteps and voices. Claimed the house was alive. Said it was watching them. He left in a hurry, and the family never came back. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, but I forced a smile. That's just a story, right? Mrs. Palmer didn't seem so sure. She gave me a quick glance before walking away, her steps hurried, like she didn't want to be associated with the past either. Later that night, I lay in bed again, the silence pressing in. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside. But there it was again. A thump. Louder this time, coming from below. I sat up, straining to listen. Nothing. Just the silence. But then I heard something else. A whisper. Soft at first, like it was being carried on the wind. It was just a murmur, a word I couldn't quite make out. My heart raced. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the house was just old. But as the days passed, the noises didn't stop. They only got worse. I'd wake in the middle of the night, and the air in my room would be freezing, as though someone had opened a window I hadn't noticed. My breath would come out in visible puffs, and I'd feel it, the presence of something else in the room. Something watching me. I checked the windows. All closed. No drafts. Just that cold, unnatural chill. The footsteps started too. Slow, deliberate. Always at night. They would come from downstairs, heavy and dragging, like someone was walking with a limp. It would stop, and I'd lie there, heart pounding in my chest, too afraid to move. After what felt like hours, the silence would return. It was during one of these nights that I found something. I had gone downstairs to get a glass of water, my nerves frayed from the constant, unnerving sounds. As I passed the old wooden door at the end of the hallway, I noticed something on the floor. A journal. Its cover was cracked, the edges frayed from age. I bent down and picked it up, dust falling off its surface. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded in places, but the words were still legible. I flipped through it slowly, reading snippets here and there. The journal belonged to the house's original owner, Ezekiel Blackwood. The name sent a shiver down my spine. He was obsessed with the occult, rituals, and things beyond this world. The pages were filled with drawings of symbols I didn't recognize, instructions for dark rituals, and mentions of a door. A door to something else. Something not human. I felt sick as I read, but I couldn't stop. The journal told of the things Ezekiel had done in that very house. The people he had brought there, the sacrifices, and the door he had opened. The house, it seemed, was more than just a building. It was a vessel, a gateway, and Ezekiel had left something behind. Something that was now awake. The footsteps were louder that night. More frantic, almost like they were chasing me. I ran upstairs, slamming the door behind me, heart racing, eyes wide with terror. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound of the dragging footsteps coming closer. Then a soft voice, barely audible, whispered my name. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The door to my room creaked open. Slowly. So slowly. And then the bed shifted. Something heavy pressing down on it. A cold hand brushed against my leg, sending waves of ice through my body. I screamed, but no sound came out. I grabbed my things in a frenzy. I couldn't stay there any longer. Not with whatever was in that house. I ran out into the night, not stopping until I was far from the house. But as I looked back, I thought I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, echoing in the distance. It wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away from that house as possible. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my hands trembled uncontrollably as I fumbled for my phone. I called a cab. I needed to get out of this town, out of this nightmare. The operator's voice was calm, too calm, and the cab was at least 20 minutes away. I didn't think I could wait that long. Every second felt like an eternity. Every creak of the trees in the wind felt like someone was watching me, waiting. I paced back and forth on the sidewalk, desperate to get away from the growing sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. But as I walked, I noticed something strange, a feeling of déjà vu. I glanced up and realized I was standing in front of the house again, the one I had just fled. How had I ended up here? I hadn't turned around. I hadn't gone back. My mind raced, but before I could make sense of it, a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Don't go back inside." I froze. The voice was soft but firm, coming from behind me. Slowly I turned to face the speaker. It was Mrs. Palmer, the neighbor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was standing near the front porch, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the warm weather. "Please listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. That house, it's not just a house. It's something else." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to ask her what she meant, but another part of me just wanted to run. To escape. "Come inside," she urged, her voice low and shaky. "We need to talk. I can't let you go back there without telling you more." There was no time for hesitation. I followed her inside, the door creaking open with a familiar groan. The moment I stepped into her house, a wave of warmth washed over me. But it didn't bring comfort. It felt like the warmth of a place that had been shut off from the rest of the world for too long. Mrs. Palmer led me to the living room, where a fire burned softly in the hearth. I sank into the nearest chair, unable to relax. The house was too quiet, the air thick, heavy. Mrs. Palmer sat across from me, her hands wringing in her lap. "You think the house is just old," she began, "but it's not. The Blackwood family, they did things. Things that opened doors. Rituals. Curses. The house was always meant to be more than just a home. It was a portal, a vessel for something beyond our world." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean, a portal?" Her eyes flickered nervously to the window as though she expected someone, or something, to be watching us. "You need to understand, Ezekiel Blackwood wasn't just a man. He was a man obsessed. Obsessed with the unknown, with the things that don't belong. He believed he could call forth powers that could change the world. But the house, it's been paying for those sins ever since." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued. "The stories you've heard, about the footsteps, the cold spots, the voices, they're all signs. Signs that the door is still open. And whoever comes to live there, they are never truly alone." I shook my head. "But it's just a house. I'm just hearing things. I'm just tired." I saw the journal. Ezekiel's journal. It's full of rambling about rituals, symbols, things that don't make sense. I didn't want to believe it. I thought I was imagining it all. Mrs. Palmer's expression darkened. "You've seen the journal? That's not good. Not good at all. You need to get rid of it. Don't look at it again. You've opened something that can't be closed so easily." I could feel my chest tightening. "What are you talking about? You're scaring me." "I'm trying to warn you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That house was built on a curse. And once you've crossed that threshold, once you've experienced the presence, it stays with you. It doesn't let go." I was on the verge of asking more when suddenly I heard it. A faint noise like a door creaking open in the distance. A soft shuffle of footsteps. I jerked my head around, but the house was empty. "What was that?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. Mrs. Palmer's face had gone pale. She was staring at the door as though she could see something that wasn't there. "It started, hasn't it?" she murmured. "The footsteps. The whispers. It never stops." I could feel my heart racing, a cold sweat trickling down my back. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of there, away from this house and whatever was following me. But before I could stand, the door to Mrs. Palmer's living room slammed open. A gust of cold air swept through the room, making the fire in the hearth flicker and die. In the doorway stood a figure, shadowed and silent, its form barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Mrs. Palmer didn't move. She just stared at the figure with wide, terrified eyes. Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward as if testing the air. Then, without a word, it turned and walked away, its footsteps echoing in the silence. I stood, my legs shaking, but when I turned to look at Mrs. Palmer, she was gone. Everything was silent again. I was alone, and the footsteps had started. I stood frozen in the middle of Mrs. Palmer's living room, the echoes of the footsteps still ringing in my ears. My heart pounded against my ribcage, and the cold air from the figure's departure lingered, chilling my skin. I could still feel it, like a whisper in my mind, urging me to follow, to go deeper into whatever darkness it had just shown me. But I didn't want to follow. I didn't want to know what it was. I glanced around the room, desperate for some sign of Mrs. Palmer, but she was nowhere to be seen. The door had swung shut behind the figure, leaving me alone in the now silent house. The warmth from the hearth had completely faded, and the once comforting crackle of the fire was now an eerie, hollow sound. I looked back toward the door, the one I had just seen the figure walk through. There was no sign of movement, no flicker of shadow. But the air felt heavier now, thicker somehow, like something unseen was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me. I took a step back, my mind racing. What had just happened? Who, or what, had I just seen? And where had Mrs. Palmer gone? I needed answers, but the thought of returning to that house, the one I had only just fled, filled me with an unbearable sense of dread. It wasn't safe. I knew that now. The house had already claimed me, pulled me back into its grasp, and I wasn't sure I could escape again. But the footsteps, the feeling of something watching me, wasn't going to let me rest. With a shuddering breath, I turned and made my way to the door. I had to go back. I had to know what was happening. I had to face whatever was lurking in that cursed place, or it would haunt me forever. As I stepped outside, I saw the familiar outline of the Blackwood house in the distance. Its windows stared back at me like dark, hollow eyes, and I knew then that I had no choice. I had to return. The pull was too strong. It felt like I was walking toward my own doom, but the fear of leaving it unfinished was worse than the fear of whatever waited for me in the house. When I arrived, the door stood ajar. I didn't know if it had been left that way by the wind or if something, or someone, had opened it for me. But there was no time to question it. I stepped over the threshold, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me as I entered. Everything inside was still. Too still. I wasn't alone though. I could feel it in the air. That presence, the one I had felt earlier, was there again, lingering just out of sight. I could hear faint whispers like voices from another room, too quiet to make out, but there. Always there. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The walls were cracked and peeling, the floor uneven and sagging underfoot. But it was nothing compared to the weight in the air, the suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I reached the living room and saw the journal again, lying on the table where I had left it. Its pages were open as if waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, but then I walked over and picked it up. The leather cover was cold under my fingertips, and the air around me seemed to drop several degrees as I flipped through the pages. The writing was frantic, almost illegible in places, but the meaning was clear. Ezekiel Blackwood had been obsessed with something dark. His notes were filled with symbols, sketches of strange diagrams, and words that felt wrong. Words I couldn't understand, but that seemed to burn into my mind. I stopped on a page that looked different from the others. It was covered in a series of intricate, swirling symbols, and beneath them, in neat but hurried handwriting, was one line that made my stomach twist. Asterisk, the door is open. It can never be closed, asterisk. A cold chill ran down my spine as I read it. It didn't make sense. A door? What kind of door was he talking about? And if it was open, what had it let in? I glanced around the room, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the air, felt amplified as though the house itself was alive, breathing in time with me. Suddenly I heard it again, footsteps. But this time they were louder, closer. And they weren't just in my mind. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. No one. The footsteps stopped. And then I felt it, the coldness sharp and biting like ice in my veins. It was coming from the hallway, from the dark space beyond the living room. Something was there. Something had been waiting for me. I moved toward it, my legs trembling beneath me. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, the darkness swallowing up the edges of the room. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like something long dead had been buried there. As I walked, I heard the whispers again, louder now, swirling around me like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. The words were unintelligible, but they were everywhere, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I saw it, a figure in the distance, barely visible in the darkness. At first, it looked like a shadow, a trick of the light. But as I moved closer, I realized it was something more. Something human. The figure stood motionless, its back to me, its head bowed. I could feel the weight of its presence, an overwhelming sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by shadows. But I could feel its eyes on me, heavy and unblinking. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." Its voice was a whisper, but it seemed to echo in my mind. The words sent a shock of fear through me, and I turned to run. But before I could take a single step, I felt something cold and clammy wrap around my ankle, pulling me down. I screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The room was dark, too dark, and I was lying on the cold, hard floor. My limbs felt heavy, and my head throbbed painfully as though I had been knocked unconscious. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, didn't even know who I was. It took a few seconds for the fog to clear from my mind. The air was thick with the same damp, oppressive cold that had greeted me when I first stepped into the house. I sat up slowly, my hands trembling as I pushed myself up. The floor beneath me was hard and uneven, and the room around me seemed to stretch into shadows, the edges of everything melting into an endless void. My heart raced, thumping in my chest like a drum. I had been pulled, hadn't I? Pulled into the darkness by something I couldn't understand. I remembered the figure, the shadow with its head bowed and its eyes, those dark, knowing eyes. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk. The voice echoed in my mind again as if the words had been branded into my skull. I stood shakily to my feet, my eyes darting around, trying to find something familiar. But everything was wrong. The room I was in was unfamiliar, a small, dimly lit space with peeling wallpaper and dust-filled corners. A faded portrait hung on the wall, a woman in black, her eyes hollow and searching. The same oppressive air, the same sense of something watching me from every corner. The journal. Ezekiel Blackwood. The words. My fingers ached to hold the journal again, to find some sort of answer, some clue to what was happening. But the floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward the table. I was not alone. The air shifted suddenly as if something had entered the room with me. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. I could feel the presence, the feeling that had been hanging in the house ever since I stepped foot inside. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was there, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was close. Click. A sound, like a door opening, echoed in the stillness. My heart skipped a beat and my pulse quickened. I turned, but there was nothing, only shadows. But the feeling, the weight of something unseen pressing in on me, was unmistakable. And then I heard it again, faint whispers as if someone was talking in a language I couldn't understand. They filled the room, buzzing in my ears, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, unable to keep up with the noise. Asterisk, shut up, asterisk, I whispered to myself, my hands shaking as I pressed my palms to my ears, but the voices wouldn't stop. The whispers turned to moans, low and guttural, like something was in pain, something suffering in the dark. My skin crawled, my heart pounding as the walls seemed to close in on me. I backed away, my foot catching on something, and I stumbled, falling to the floor. The journal. It was there, lying in the dust on the floor, half open. The page where I had left off was still visible. My fingers curled around it without thinking, and I yanked the journal toward me, desperate for any kind of answer. I read the words aloud, almost as a way to anchor myself to reality. The door is open. It can never be closed. My voice sounded hollow in the room, like an echo from somewhere far away. And as I read the words, something inside me shifted, like a cold hand was pressing against my chest, constricting my breath. There was a sound behind me. Footsteps. Heavy and deliberate. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. I knew what was standing behind me. I could feel it. I slowly got to my feet, keeping my back to the wall as I backed away from the sound. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. Silence. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I dared a glance over my shoulder. Nothing. I was alone, but I could feel it. The presence. It was still there, lingering in the dark corners of the room, waiting for something. Or someone. I had to leave. I had to get out of here before whatever it was could find me. I turned toward the door, but the moment I stepped forward, I froze. The whispers had stopped. There was nothing but the pounding of my heart in my ears. But then, in the silence, I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper, but not like the others. This one was clear. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back, asterisk. It was the same voice from before. But this time it was closer. I spun around, my eyes searching for the source of the sound. I felt the cold air against my skin, and I saw something, just a flicker of movement in the shadows. Something was there. A shape. A figure. Moved. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted, running down the hallway as fast as I could, my legs carrying me with a speed I didn't know I had. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever this thing was that had been haunting me, tormenting me. The door. The front door. It was just ahead. But as I reached for the handle, a cold hand gripped my wrist and I screamed. I could feel its fingers, icy and unyielding, holding me in place. Asterisk, you're not leaving, asterisk, the voice hissed. I jerked my arm, pulling as hard as I could, but the grip was too strong. The shadows swallowed me and everything went dark. When I woke up again, I was lying on the floor. The door was still closed. The house was silent. But the air felt different, lighter, almost empty. I didn't stay long enough to find out what that meant. I ran. The air outside was a bitter cold, but it didn't matter. I didn't feel it. My legs carried me far from the house, past the old fence that I had noticed earlier, the one that seemed to have been there forever. I ran and ran, not stopping until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would collapse under me. Only then did I slow, stumbling to a stop by the side of the road. I bent over, clutching my knees, gasping for breath, trying to steady the panic that had risen in my chest. What had just happened? What was that thing? Why was it there? Why? Why had it followed me? It felt like the world was spinning around me, spinning too fast. I tried to force myself to think, to understand, but my thoughts were scattered and broken. The air, even out here, was thick with the feeling of something unseen pressing in on me. A presence, always watching, never leaving. I looked back toward the house, half expecting to see it looming in the distance, watching me from behind the trees like a predator in the dark. But it was just a house. Just a house now. The shadows that clung to it before were gone. Still, I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed. I kept walking, keeping my distance from the house. I didn't want to go back there. Not yet. I needed time. But the need to understand, to know what had happened, gnawed at me like a wound that couldn't heal. What was that thing? Who was Ezekiel Blackwood really? Was it true? Had he really opened a door to something unnatural? And if so, what was waiting on the other side? The whispers, the heavy footsteps, the coldness, the sense of being watched, it all came rushing back, overwhelming my senses. My thoughts were becoming more frantic now, as if my mind couldn't keep up with everything. I had to know. I had to figure this out before it drove me insane. I couldn't leave it like this, not without answers. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the sun was dipping low in the sky when I found myself standing outside the small library in town. The warm light inside beckoned me, a temporary relief from the ever-growing darkness in my mind. I had to do it. I had to get answers. Inside, the library was quiet, just the low murmur of an elderly man behind the counter flipping through a book. I walked past the rows of bookshelves, scanning the titles until I found what I was looking for. A history of the town, of the house. The book was old, the pages yellowed with age, but it was exactly what I needed. As I flipped through it, I found reference after reference to Blackwood Manor. The first mention of Ezekiel Blackwood was one of curiosity, noting that he had arrived in the town decades ago, a solitary figure who lived quietly in the manor. But then, over time, the whispers began. Strange happenings began to plague the house. Neighbors talked about strange lights in the windows, about people seeing figures moving in and out of the house, even when there were no guests. But the worst came when Blackwood began his obsession with the occult. I stopped on one page, my fingers trembling as I read. Blackwood's interest in the occult grew steadily over the years. Some say he sought immortality, others say he was trying to harness dark powers. His obsession led him to strange rituals, which he performed in the cellar of Blackwood Manor. His last known words before his disappearance in 1922 were recorded by a local priest. "I have opened the door, and now it will not close." No trace of Blackwood was ever found. I felt a chill slide down my spine. I couldn't help but look up, as if expecting to see the shadows of Blackwood's presence staring at me from the corner of the room. The room felt colder now, the weight of the words in my hands sinking into me. The door he had opened. What if it was still open? I had to go back. I had to go back and see for myself. I couldn't leave this town, couldn't live with the uncertainty gnawing at me. I had to face whatever had been haunting me. I had to find out what Blackwood had done, what he had awakened. The librarian looked up, his eyes narrowing when he saw the book in my hands. "You're looking into Blackwood, huh?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. He seemed to know more than he was letting on, his expression unreadable. I nodded, my throat dry. "You're not the first to come looking for him," he said, "but you'll wish you were. Those who try to get answers end up different. You'd be better off forgetting about him." His words felt like a warning, but it didn't matter. I couldn't walk away now. I needed answers. More than that, I needed closure. Whatever it took. I returned the book to its shelf, nodding to the librarian as I walked out of the library. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and the town was cloaked in the thickening darkness. My heart raced as I walked back toward the house. I had a terrible sense of foreboding, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. The house was waiting. As I approached the front door, the same feeling from before, the one that made my skin crawl, settled over me again. I hesitated, standing on the porch for a moment, trying to summon the courage to walk inside. The air was thick with that familiar heaviness. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. But this time they were coming from inside. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The door creaked as it slowly swung open, and I stepped inside. The house was dark, silent except for the faint sound of creaking floorboards. But I wasn't alone. The moment I stepped through the door, the weight of the house pressed in on me. It felt like the walls were breathing, exhaling cold, stale air that smelled faintly of dust and something older, something off. The floor creaked beneath my feet as if the house itself was waking up, aware of my presence. I hesitated in the entryway, trying to shake the unnerving sensation that someone, or something, was watching me. My eyes darted around the dimly lit hallway, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of dark, decaying wood and the quiet hum of the house settling deeper into itself. I moved forward cautiously, my footsteps muffled on the old floorboards. The strange noise I had heard earlier, the footsteps, had stopped. Or perhaps they were just waiting for me to make the next move. I gripped the railing of the staircase, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers as I ascended, one slow step at a time. The house seemed to groan with each movement, the sound coming from the very walls themselves, as if the house was trying to speak or warn me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to find out what was happening here. The upper floor was just as silent and oppressive as the first. My eyes scanned the hall, falling on the room at the end, the one I had avoided, the one that seemed to hold so much of the house's secret. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. I swallowed hard, stepping toward it, every instinct in my body screaming to turn around and leave. But I had already come too far. I had already uncovered too much. As I approached the door, the coldness of the air grew more pronounced, and I could feel a strange pressure pressing in on my chest, like I was walking into a place where the air was too thick to breathe. I pushed the door open, and a gust of stale air hit my face, making my eyes water. The room inside was smaller than I expected, but it felt vast, empty, yet filled with an oppressive presence. The walls were covered in yellowing wallpaper, faded and peeling, as if the room had been forgotten by time itself. The faint glow of moonlight filtered in through the dusty window, casting long, eerie shadows on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, but there was something else, something unmistakable, a feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by something else, something not quite human. I stepped inside, and the floor creaked loudly under my weight. It echoed in the stillness as if the house was listening. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, perhaps a clue, or a sign that all of this was just some horrible misunderstanding. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the room's history press in on me, like the air itself was holding its breath. That I saw it. On the far side of the room, under the window, sat an old wooden chest. It was closed, but something about it caught my eye. It didn't belong here, not in this room, not in this house. It was too out of place, too deliberate, as if someone had put it there for me to find. I moved toward it, each step measured, my heart pounding louder with every inch closer. The air grew colder as I approached the chest, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the house. I knelt in front of it, my fingers trembling as I reached for the latch. It clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. Inside there was a stack of old, worn books, their pages yellowed with age. The first one on top caught my attention immediately. Its cover was leather, worn and cracked with age. But it was the title that made my blood run cold. The Rituals of Ezekiel Blackwood. My heart skipped a beat. I had found it. The very thing that had been haunting me since I first set foot in this place. I opened the book, the pages stiff and brittle under my fingertips. The writing was faint, but it was clear enough to read. The further I turned, the more disturbing the words became. Blackwood's obsession with the occult, his twisted rituals, his attempts to open a door to another world. And then there was the entry that sent a chill straight to my bones. Tonight, I will perform the final ritual. I will open the door and call forth the entity that waits beyond. It is my time. The door is open and it will never close. I am no longer just Ezekiel Blackwood. I am its vessel. The last sentence was hastily scribbled, almost frenzied. I could hear my breath coming faster now, a sharp sound in the quiet room. My fingers shook as I turned the pages, desperate to find more, to understand exactly what Blackwood had done. But there was nothing more. Just that, his final words. I closed the book with a sharp snap, my mind racing. The door Blackwood had opened. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was real. Whatever he had summoned, whatever he had unleashed, it was still here. It was still waiting. And it knew I had found it. The temperature dropped suddenly, the coldness piercing my skin like a knife. My breath misted in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt a presence, heavy and suffocating, closing in on me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Still, I wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed in the corner of the room. It was closer now, closer than before, and the air felt thick with a presence I could not see but could feel. And then it came. A cold hand, icy and bone-chilling, rested on my shoulder. I froze, paralyzed by fear, the hairs on my skin standing on end. I turned slowly, and for the first time since I had come into this house, I saw it. A figure. Tall and dark, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes glowing faintly, like embers in the dark. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze burning into me, drilling into my soul. I couldn't breathe. Then, in a voice that was not a voice but a whisper in my mind, it spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." And with that, it vanished, leaving me alone in the cold, silent room, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was open, and whatever was waiting on the other side was no longer content to stay there. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as the darkness seemed to close in around me. My body was frozen, as if the figure had left an icy grip on my very soul, and every movement felt impossible. The room was still, but the air was thick with a sense of something, watching, waiting. I reached for the wall, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to steady myself. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the house settling around me, but the oppressive silence felt even more suffocating now. My mind was racing, desperate to make sense of what had just happened. I had seen it. No, felt it. The presence, the figure, whatever it was real. Ezekiel Blackwood's ritual had opened something, and whatever had crossed over was no longer confined to the shadows. I glanced at the chest again, my eyes falling on the leather-bound book still lying open. Blackwood had known. He had known that the door would never close, that whatever he had invited in would stay, lurking, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And I had wandered too close. My fingers moved to the book again, trembling as I flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a book of rituals. It was a record of the house, of its history, of everything Blackwood had done to summon what now haunted it. But the pages weren't complete. There were gaps, places where the ink had bled or faded, where words had been hurriedly scribbled over in a frantic scrawl. I felt a sense of dread settle over me as I came across one final page. It wasn't written by Blackwood, but by someone else, someone who had been here after him. The handwriting was more frantic, almost desperate. "Do not stay. It is not just the door that is open. It is the mind. Once you have seen what lies beyond, you can never unsee it. It waits. It always waits. And it will find you." The last words were scratched out, barely legible, but the meaning was clear. I was in its sights. It was waiting for me. I slammed the book shut, the sound sharp in the silence. My breath hitched as I turned, my heart racing again. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the house was slowly suffocating me. I could feel the presence again, just out of sight, waiting in the corners of the room, in the shadows. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. Not with that thing still in the house, not with the door still open. But as I reached for the door, a sudden, overwhelming chill washed over me, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to give way, as if the house itself was trying to pull me down into the depths. A loud bang echoed from somewhere below, heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if something was moving in the dark. I spun around, my body stiff with terror, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet of the room. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, low, and chilling, like a whisper carried on the wind. "It's too late for you now." My blood ran cold, and I froze, every part of me screaming to run, to get out of this place, but my body refused to move. I couldn't move. I could only listen, paralyzed by the voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. I spun around in panic, my heart hammering in my chest. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, the darkness thicker. I fumbled for the doorknob, my hands slick with sweat as I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed from the outside. I was trapped. I looked around the room again, desperately searching for some way out, some way to escape. The chest. The book. That was the key, wasn't it? Blackwood had opened the door, but it was that journal, that record of his descent into madness, that had warned me. But the warning had come too late. I turned back to the chest, but as I did, I saw it, there in the far corner of the room, in the shadows. The figure. It was no longer a shadow, no longer something distant. It was standing there, watching me with those glowing eyes, the cold air radiating from its form. And then it moved. It was fast, too fast. One moment it was still, and the next it was right in front of me, its cold presence overwhelming. My breath caught in my throat as the figure leaned forward, its face still hidden in shadow, but the weight of its gaze pressing down on me like an unspoken judgment. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it whispered again, the words like ice in my veins. "Now you belong to it." I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, my limbs frozen, my mind screaming for escape. But there was no escape. The figure raised a hand, long and skeletal, and I felt an icy breath against my skin as it reached for me, its fingers brushing my cheek. And then the room went black. When I awoke, I wasn't in the room anymore. The house was gone, replaced by an empty, endless void. I stood alone, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sound, no movement, just a suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, just as before, the voice whispered, "You've seen too much. It's only a matter of time now." And that was when I realized. The door was still open, and it was waiting for the next person to step through. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, as if the very air itself was thick with the weight of something unseen, something waiting. My chest heaved, trying to draw in air that felt like it was made of dust and shadows. My legs were trembling beneath me, but I couldn't move, couldn't find the strength to take a step forward or back. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, choked by the suffocating silence. My thoughts felt muddled, fogged over by fear, by confusion. Was I still in the house? Was I dead? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. But as I stood there, frozen in the blackness, I could hear it, the soft, rhythmic sound of something breathing. The sound was slow, deliberate, as though whatever was in the void with me was taking its time, savoring the moment. And then, just like that, the silence returned. The breathing had stopped, but it left a chilling echo in the back of my mind, a reminder that I was no longer alone. I forced myself to move, taking a tentative step forward, my foot landing on something solid. The ground felt cold, rough beneath me like cracked stone. I could barely see, but the faintest sliver of light seemed to break through the darkness, a small crack in the void. It was enough to guide me, enough to urge me to move. And so I did. Every step I took was met with resistance, as though the very space I was walking through was trying to pull me back, to keep me from escaping whatever nightmare I had entered. But I pushed through, my pulse quickening, my body screaming for release. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could feel it, feel the presence moving just beyond the reach of the light. It was there, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I could sense its cold gaze, its hunger, as if it were just waiting for the right moment to pounce. And then, in the distance, I saw something. It was faint at first, just a shadow among shadows, but it was unmistakable. A figure, hunched over, moving slowly toward me. It didn't make a sound as it moved, its form slipping through the darkness like a wisp of smoke. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out its features, couldn't see its face, but I didn't need to. I knew what it was. I knew what was coming. The figure grew closer, its movement deliberate, unhurried, as if it were taking its time to savor my terror. And then, just as it was almost within arm's reach, it stopped. The silence returned, but this time it felt worse. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me with the weight of unspoken threats. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears, louder than ever before. The figure tilted its head, just slightly, as if studying me, as if deciding what to do next. And then it whispered, its voice like a distant, cold wind. "You shouldn't have stayed." The words sent a jolt of panic through me, and I stumbled backward, my body shaking. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever that thing was could get to me. But then the light in the distance flickered and went out, plunging me back into darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, panic clawing at my chest. I was blind now, alone in the void. Suddenly the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, my hands reaching out for something to grab onto, but there was nothing. No walls, no floor, no light, just endless, bottomless blackness. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the abyss. There was no way to know how far I was falling, no way to gauge time or distance, just the sensation of falling, endlessly. And then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. I landed hard on the ground, my body jarred by the sudden impact. I gasped, my lungs aching, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I lay there, motionless, not daring to move, too afraid to look up, to look around. But the silence was so absolute, so suffocating, that I couldn't stay still. I had to move. I had to get out of this place, whatever it was. I forced myself to sit up, then stand, my legs wobbling beneath me. The air felt cold, unnaturally so, like it had been drained of warmth and life. I looked around. Nothing. Just more of the same, empty, unfeeling blackness stretching out in every direction. There was no horizon, no end to the void. No walls, no floor, no ceiling, just darkness that went on forever. But I knew. I knew that whatever this was, it was not just an empty space. It was a trap. A prison. And I was its prisoner. I couldn't stay here. I turned around and began walking, my steps echoing through the nothingness. I had no idea where I was going, no idea if there was even a way out, but I had to keep moving. The alternative was worse. As I walked, I felt it again, the presence, watching, waiting. It was just beyond my reach, lingering in the shadows, following my every move. I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck, but when I turned, there was nothing there. But it was always there, always watching, always waiting. And then, in the distance, I saw it again, the faintest flicker of light. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my feet pounding against the cold ground, my heart in my throat. The light was so faint, so distant, but it was enough to pull me forward, to give me a glimpse of hope. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't getting any closer. It was like I was running in place, trapped in some endless loop. I stopped. The darkness closed in on me, thicker than ever before. And then I heard it again, the whisper cold and hollow. You can't leave. Not now. And that was when I knew. I wasn't in control anymore. The house had claimed me. I jolted awake, my body drenched in sweat, my heart still racing from the nightmare. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, thought I had outrun whatever had been chasing me. But the air around me was still cold, still heavy, and the silence was suffocating. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling as I wiped my forehead, trying to steady my breathing. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a dream. But the house felt different now, like it was alive, breathing, shifting, watching me. The creaking of the floorboards sounded louder than ever, the whispers of the past reverberating through the walls. It wasn't just in my head. Something was wrong, something had changed. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me. The hallway outside my bedroom was still dark, the faint light from the kitchen casting long shadows against the walls. I walked slowly, my footsteps soft on the wooden floor, as if trying not to disturb the stillness. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. As I reached the end of the hallway, I froze. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was a figure. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat was dry and I was frozen in place, my body paralyzed by fear. The figure stood still, unmoving, just like the one I had seen in the darkness, but this time it was closer, too close. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken shape, forming a dark silhouette of a person. I could see the outline of a face, but it was distorted, like a reflection in water, rippling and shifting with every breath the figure took. The air around it felt colder, the temperature dropping as the presence grew stronger. I wanted to turn around and run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was stuck, my eyes locked on the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't speak at first, but I could hear it breathing. Slow, steady, like the air itself was being drawn from the room. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a pressure in the room that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. And then it whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." The words were like ice, sinking deep into my bones. I felt them crawl up my spine, sending a chill through my body that I couldn't shake. My vision blurred, my mind clouded with panic. I was trapped in this nightmare, unable to escape. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. All I could do was watch as the figure slowly began to move, its form drifting forward with an unsettling grace. It wasn't walking. It was gliding as if it were floating just above the ground. My body screamed at me to run, to do anything to get away, but I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. I could feel it drawing closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then, just as it reached out for me, the lights flickered. The figure vanished. I blinked, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The room was empty now, the hallway silent, as if nothing had happened. But the weight of the air remained, the feeling that something was still there, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it another hallucination, another trick of the mind? Or was there something in this house that I still didn't understand? I turned back toward the stairs, my legs unsteady as I made my way down. The house felt different now, heavier. The floorboards creaked louder under my feet, the walls groaning in protest, as if the house itself was alive, reacting to my every movement. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening, why this place felt like it was slowly suffocating me. I made my way to the study, where I had found the journal before, the one that had contained the cryptic notes about the house's past. The floor beneath me felt cold, the chill seeping up through my shoes, but I didn't care. I needed answers. The journal was still there, sitting on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, my fingers trembling as I skimmed the pages, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening to me. And then I found it. A passage, written in shaky handwriting, caught my eye. The ritual is complete. The door is open. It cannot be closed. I read the words again and then again, my mind racing. The door. The ritual. The curse. The house. I had to find out more. I had to know what had been done here, what had been unleashed. But the more I read, the more I realized how little I understood. Each page was filled with references to rituals, symbols, and incantations that made no sense to me. But there was one thing that stood out, one thing that kept repeating. The door. Whatever had been opened, it wasn't just a doorway to another room or another world. It was something else, something darker, something that had been waiting for someone to come along and open it. I closed the journal, my hands shaking as I set it down on the desk. The room was colder now, the shadows creeping in from the corners, as if the house itself were trying to consume me. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before it was too late. But as I turned to the door, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me from the hallway. I froze. My blood ran cold as I turned, slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The air grew even colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. And then, from the other side of the door, a whisper. "You're not going anywhere." The voice was cold, lifeless, and filled with an unnatural malice. It sent a wave of terror through me, and I realized too late that there was no escape. The house had already claimed me. I stumbled backward, my hand scrambling for the door handle, but I couldn't find it. My fingers grazed the smooth surface, desperately searching, but the door seemed to have become part of the wall itself. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel my heart slamming against my chest, threatening to burst. The whisper from the other side of the door, that cold, mocking voice, echoed in my mind, "You're not going anywhere." It sent shivers down my spine, leaving a trail of ice where it touched. I had to get out. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick, pressing against my lungs, making it harder to breathe. I turned in a circle, my eyes frantic as I searched for an exit, any way to leave. But the shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally, moving in a way that didn't feel right, like they were alive, watching, waiting. I knew I had to face whatever was outside that door. Whatever had been waiting for me since I stepped foot in this cursed house. I finally managed to yank the door open, the hinges screeching in protest, the sound like nails scraping against a chalkboard. I stepped out into the hallway, my body shaking, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. The house was silent now, deathly still, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The footsteps had stopped. The voice had stopped. But the darkness around me felt deeper, thicker. Like the shadows themselves were hiding something terrible. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to escape this nightmare. But as I moved down the hallway, I felt it, a presence behind me creeping closer, just out of sight. I dared not look back, but I could hear it, feel it. The oppressive weight of something following me, lurking in the dark. The house was alive. It was as if it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every step I took. The creaking of the floorboards, the groaning of the walls, it was all part of it, part of the thing that was waiting for me to make a mistake, to show weakness. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper right behind me. "Run." I froze. My blood ran cold and I turned, but there was no one there. Just darkness. Just emptiness. But the air was heavy, thick with the feeling that something was watching me, closing in. I couldn't breathe. The house was closing in and there was no way out. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the house, the sound of my breathing deafening in my ears. I passed the staircase, the old creaking wood groaning beneath me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The door. The front door. It was just ahead. I could see the faint light from the outside through the cracks in the doorframe, and I pushed myself harder, faster. I had to reach it. But as my hand grasped the doorknob, the house seemed to groan in protest. The air around me shifted, cold and suffocating, and a strange pressure built in my chest. I twisted the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked. It was as if the house itself had sealed me in, trapping me here forever. I pulled at the knob again, my hands slick with sweat, my mind frantically searching for another way out. The whispers started again, low at first, then growing louder until they filled the entire house. "You can't leave." The voice was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing in every corner of the room. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar, a cacophony of voices, each one more menacing than the last. I felt my knees give way beneath me, my legs too weak to support me any longer. I collapsed against the door, tears streaming down my face, my body shaking with a fear I could no longer control. I had to get out. But the house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me leave. Suddenly the air shifted again. A chill ran through me, colder than anything I had ever felt. My breath clouded in front of me, visible in the air, and I could feel it, something moving in the darkness. I heard a sound, a scraping like nails dragging across wood. And then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I looked up, and there it was, standing at the end of the hallway. The figure. It was taller now, its shape more defined, more solid. The shadows twisted around it like a cloak, its face hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and empty. It didn't move. It just stood there watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at it, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure that had been haunting me since the moment I stepped into this house. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was not the same as before. It was deeper now, more guttural, like it was coming from somewhere far away, from something ancient and unforgiving. The figure stepped forward, its footfalls echoing in the silence. The house seemed to pulse with each step it took, the walls vibrating, the floor creaking under the weight of its presence. I scrambled to my feet, my hands desperately trying to turn the doorknob again, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, its dark shape becoming more solid with every passing second. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You shouldn't have come." The house was alive. The figure was alive. It was all part of the curse, all part of the ritual that had been performed so long ago. And now it was too late. There was no escape. There was no leaving. The house had already claimed me. The figure was inches away from me now, and I could feel the coldness radiating from it, freezing the very air around me. And then, as it reached out for me, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness. I woke up in darkness, the silence almost suffocating. My body felt heavy, weighted down, as if the very air was pressing against me. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow and quick, my heart racing. My surroundings were unfamiliar, but I knew, deep down, that I was still in the house. The shadows clung to every corner, the air thick and damp. I could still smell the strange scent from before, something old and musty, mixed with a faint trace of something metallic like blood. The room felt colder now, as though the warmth of the house had been sucked away, leaving only an oppressive chill in its place. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the pitch-black darkness, but it was no use. I could barely make out the outlines of the furniture around me, the faintest shape of the walls and floor. My breath fogged up in front of me, a sign that the temperature had dropped even further. I was on the floor. Had I fallen? Had I passed out from fear? I tried to move, but my limbs felt stiff, like they hadn't been used in hours. I forced myself to push up, my hands trembling as they scraped against the cold wooden floor. I could hear the sound of my own breath, heavy and erratic, filling the room like a storm. Where was it? Where was the figure? I swallowed hard, feeling the lump in my throat, the taste of metal in the back of my mouth. The events before the darkness overwhelmed me, played in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The figure had been so close. I had felt its presence, its coldness pressing against me like a physical weight. But now, nothing. Just the silence, the cold, the emptiness. I pushed myself up to my knees, my hands scraping against the floor for purchase. Every inch of the house felt wrong. The air itself felt like it was alive, crawling under my skin. I could hear nothing but the rush of blood in my ears, the silence around me pressing in, suffocating me. Then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper from far away. But it grew louder, clearer. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The sound echoed in the dark, too close, too familiar. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I quickly glanced around, trying to find a source for the noise, but there was nothing. No figure. No shape. Just the shadows, twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. And then I saw it. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely visible through the cracks in the walls, like a dim candle flickering against the night. My pulse quickened, a glimmer of hope cutting through the terror. Maybe it was the front door? Maybe I had made it to the exit after all. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaky, my head spinning. Every part of my body screamed at me to leave, to run, to get out. But something held me in place, a strange pull that kept me moving toward the flickering light. The footsteps followed me, growing louder, closer. The air around me grew even colder, and I could feel it now. Something was right behind me. It was too close, too real. I turned, my heart in my throat, ready to face whatever had been following me. But there was nothing there. Only darkness. Only the oppressive quiet. I took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath me, and the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that made my skin crawl, my pulse thudding in my ears. But then I heard it again. A whisper, low and guttural, right behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, my body rigid with fear, my breath caught in my chest. I didn't dare turn around. I knew what was behind me. I knew what I would see. The pressure in the air increased, pushing against my chest, choking me. It was as if the house itself was alive, pressing in, squeezing the life out of me. And then it spoke again. "Run." The voice was clearer now, and it was not just one voice. It was many, layered on top of each other, like a choir of whispers, all urging me to run, to escape. But where? There was no escape. The house had already claimed me. I spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but the darkness was unyielding. The footsteps had returned, louder now, closer, faster. I could feel the vibrations of each step through the floor, hear the creaking of the wood as if the house itself was walking toward me. Suddenly, the flickering light grew brighter, illuminating the hallway ahead. It was not the front door. It wasn't the escape I had hoped for. It was a mirror. The light came from an old, cracked mirror that hung at the end of the hall. The glass was warped, distorted, but I could see my reflection. No, not just my reflection. The figure was behind me, its form faint but unmistakable, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I screamed, stumbling backward, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't run. The house had me trapped. I reached out for the mirror, my fingers grazing the cold glass. It felt like ice, but as soon as my skin made contact, the mirror shifted, rippling like water. My reflection twisted, and for a moment I saw something else in the glass. A figure standing behind me, its face pale and twisted, eyes wide with terror. My own reflection screamed, but I couldn't hear it. Only the house, only the whispers. Run. I had to escape. I had to leave before it was too late. But the house wouldn't let me go. The figure's hand reached through the mirror, its fingers brushing my skin. And in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just the house that was alive. I was trapped. Trapped in the house, trapped in the curse, trapped with whatever waited on the other side of the door. The whispers filled my ears. The footsteps were deafening. The cold, the pressure, the fear, it all closed in around me until there was nothing left but the darkness. And then everything went silent. The house had swallowed me whole. I woke up again. But this time the silence was different. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating kind I had come to expect from the house. It was empty. So, a void that stretched out endlessly, swallowing any hint of sound, of life. I opened my eyes slowly, not trusting the reality around me. My body was stiff, my limbs aching as though I had been lying in the same position for hours, or days. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard, trying to clear the fog from my mind. The darkness was thick, but there was no longer the suffocating pressure that had been with me before. No cold air biting at my skin. No oppressive shadows lurking in every corner. I stood up carefully, my body unsteady, as though I hadn't moved in a long time. My feet found the floor beneath me, but it didn't feel like the old wooden floors of the house. It was smooth, polished stone, cool against my bare feet. I looked around, but there was nothing. No walls, no doors, no windows, just an infinite stretch of emptiness. The house was gone. Or was it? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was lurking just beyond my sight. A quiet hum, a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the ground, was all that remained of the house. It was as though the walls had faded, leaving only the residue of whatever dark energy had once inhabited them. I was standing in a place that didn't belong to the real world. A place caught between two realities, one that had already swallowed me and one that I had just woken up in. I swallowed, feeling the dryness in my throat. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious, but the fact that I was still here in this strange, empty space didn't feel like the end. It felt like something else, something darker, something more sinister. Then, just as I began to question whether I was losing my mind, I heard it. A sound, a soft shuffle of footsteps, far off in the distance. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to acknowledge the sound, but my body seemed to act on its own, slowly twisting in the direction of the noise. The silence felt thick, too thick. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, thumping louder with every passing second. And then I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't like the shadows I had seen in the house. This one was darker, denser, like it was alive, like it was pulling in the light around it, sucking it away. The shadow shifted, a dark figure that seemed to move in and out of focus, not entirely solid, not entirely real, but it was there. I took a hesitant step back, but the shadow moved too, closer. My breath quickened and the footsteps grew louder, more pronounced. The sound of heavy, deliberate steps coming toward me, each one slower, more calculated than the last. It was coming closer. I felt the weight of it, like a presence that was filling the space around me, pressing in from every direction. The air began to grow thick again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was suffocating in a different way, hot, heavy, as if the very air was thick with anticipation. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow had reached me and I could feel its presence all around me, in the air, in my chest, in my skin. And then a voice. It wasn't the same voice from before. It wasn't the whisper of the house or the figure. It was something different, something more ancient. A voice that rumbled like thunder, deep and resonant, filling the emptiness around me. You've never truly left. The voice echoed in the space, reverberating in the silence, and my body froze. It was a voice that carried with it the weight of ages, a voice that belonged to something older than the house, older than the curse that had consumed me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The presence, the shadow, moved closer still, its shape becoming more defined. It was tall, its form towering over me, the darkness swirling around it like a cloak, hiding its true shape. The voice came again, closer this time, right next to my ear. You thought you escaped. You thought you left it behind. But you've always been here. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening with fear as the words sank into me. It was as if everything I had experienced, the house, the whispers, the terror, had been building to this moment. And now I understood. It wasn't the house that had been haunting me. It was this place, this void, this limbo between realities. I wasn't alive, but I wasn't dead either. The shadow moved, its form shifting in and out of focus like a mirage. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, pale and unblinking, burning with an unnatural light. And it spoke again, its voice low and raspy, filled with an ancient power. You will never escape. And then, as if the words themselves had summoned it, the world around me began to shift. The darkness didn't fade. It deepened. The air crackled with energy and I could feel it, a cold, biting force like the claws of something reaching out from the void. I gasped for breath, but the air was thick and suffocating. The shadow stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, filling every inch of the space around me. I could feel it inside me, twisting, coiling, growing stronger with every passing second. And then it touched me. Its hand, cold and insubstantial, pressed against my chest, and in that moment I understood. The house had never been the source. It had never been the beginning or the end. This place, this endless void, had been waiting for me. Waiting to claim me, to drag me into its depths, where time and space didn't exist, where the living and the dead were bound together in a never-ending loop. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The shadow's grip tightened, pulling me deeper into the void, into the darkness. And as I was pulled into the nothingness, I felt it, the last trace of my fear, my humanity, slipping away. The house had swallowed me whole. But now I was nothing more than a part of the darkness itself, forever lost. And the whispers began again. You've never truly left.